Some men enter history through triumph. Friedrich Paulus entered through collapse. When people speak of Stalingrad, they talk about destruction, starvation, frostbite, and the moment when an army of hundreds of thousands was swallowed by a city of ruins and smoke. They talk about Hitler's rage, about Soviet endurance, about the turning of a world war. But beneath all that, at the center of the storm, stood one man who spent his entire life avoiding risk, avoiding emotion, avoiding uncertainty, until uncertainty consumed everything around him. Friedrich Paulus was not born a warrior. He was born an administrator. Precise, polite, neat. His handwriting was immaculate. His uniforms were spotless. He measured decisions the way an engineer measures steel. And then the war forced him to lead in a place where nothing was orderly, nothing predictable, nothing within control. Stalingrad was the place where the man who always followed orders received the one order he could not obey: victory or death. Paulus did not come from aristocracy. He was not born into military prestige. He began his life wanting to join the navy, but weak health and lack of connections forced him into the army. There he found a world that rewarded careful minds, planning, logistics, precision. He learned how to move divisions across maps with clean arrows and perfect timing. He rose slowly, methodically, not because he inspired men, but because he organized them. While other officers leaned on confidence, Paulus leaned on charts. His superiors loved him. His subordinates feared disappointment more than punishment. And then came 1930 and Adolf Hitler. Paulus did not worship Hitler, but he believed in the army, believed in duty, in obedience, in the hierarchy that said orders were not to be questioned. In Hitler, Paulus saw not ideology, but momentum, a leader who promised action and destiny. That was enough for him. His rise accelerated. He became the deputy chief of staff under General Franz Halder, where he helped plan operations that shocked the world: Poland, France, the Balkans. Paulus became known as a master of mapping possibility. But maps lie. They cannot show suffering. They cannot show consequences. And then came the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, stretched the German army across endless plains. Paulus studied the front, calculated distances, supplies, weather reports. He grew cautious. Hitler hated caution. Hitler wanted boldness. Hitler wanted victory on demand. When the Sixth Army needed a new commander, one willing to drive deeper into Soviet territory regardless of cost, Hitler chose Paulus. Paulus took command. His orders were clear: advance to the Volga. Take Stalingrad. Cut off Soviet lifelines. Do not fail. Paulus studied his maps and believed it could be done. He did not yet understand that war would tear up his maps and laugh at his calculations. Stalingrad was not a city. It was a trap of concrete, fire, and shattered glass. Every building became a fortress, every ruin a sniper's nest, every street a grave. German soldiers nicknamed the city Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats, because fighting happened in basements, alleys, sewer tunnels. Paulus tried to fight a mathematical war in a place that demanded instinct. Then winter came. Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus and encircled the entire Sixth Army. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, Romanian soldiers, Allied units, all trapped in a frozen ring of death. Paulus radioed for permission to break out. Hitler forbade it. Hitler promised that supplies would arrive by air. They didn't. Men boiled leather uniforms for food. Horses were eaten. Ammunition ran dry. Frostbite blackened fingers. Paulus requested permission to surrender. Hitler responded, "The Sixth Army will stand fast." Paulus watched his men die by the thousands, not from bullets, but from starvation and cold. He refused to abandon them. He refused to escape. He waited for an order that would never come. On the last day of January, in a frozen basement beneath the ruins of a department store, Paulus received a call. "You have been promoted to Field Marshal." No German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive. Hitler's message was clear. Paulus put down the phone. He did not shoot himself. He did not fight to the last man. He did not cling to a loyalty that had demanded sacrifice but offered nothing in return. He surrendered. In that moment, Paulus became something Hitler feared: a man who stopped obeying. After the war, Paulus testified against the regime he once served. He lived quietly. He died quietly. No monuments, no triumph, no heroism. Just a former staff officer who realized too late that obedience without conscience is not discipline. It is surrender of the soul. Tonight, we return to that city of ashes, to the frost-covered trenches where men clung to life, to the maps that lied, and the man who followed them too faithfully. This is the entire history of Friedrich Paulus, the general who surrendered Stalingrad, a man crushed between obedience and reality, and proof that sometimes the greatest act of courage is refusing to continue a lie. Before we begin, take a second just for yourself. Where are you right now? Are you listening in bed, feeling the room quiet around you? Or are you somewhere alone with headphones, letting the world pause for a moment? And what time is it for you? Late night, early morning, or somewhere in that soft silence in between? I love imagining these stories traveling across miles and time zones, landing exactly in the moment you needed something slow, calm, and steady. And if these deep, unhurried journeys through the past help you unwind, think, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. It tells me that someone out there values storytelling that breathes, and it keeps me inspired to make the next chapter for you. January 31st, 1943. 6 o'clock in the morning. 20 feet beneath what was once Stalingrad's central department store, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus sits at a wooden table, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The tremor isn't from cold, though the temperature hovers near freezing. It's the same psychosomatic shake that has plagued him for months, worsening with each passing day of the encirclement. Above him, Soviet artillery shells impact the ruins with rhythmic precision, shaking loose concrete dust that drifts down like grey snow. On the table before him lies a radio message from Adolf Hitler, received just hours ago. The words are brief, absolute, and utterly disconnected from reality. Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will hold their positions to the last man and the last bullet. Paulus reads it again, though he has memorized every word. His chief of staff, Major General Arthur Schmidt, stands nearby, rigid and defiant, still believing in miracles that will never come. The scene in that basement bunker represents the final collapse of what was once Germany's most powerful field army. 91,000 men will surrender over the next 48 hours, skeletal figures in tattered uniforms emerging from cellars and ruins. They are the remnants of an army that numbered 265,000 men when the Soviet trap closed just 10 weeks earlier. The rest are dead, frozen into the rubble of Stalingrad or buried in mass graves hastily dug in the frozen earth. Paulus himself is a physical wreck. He has lost 40 pounds. His uniform hangs loose on his once imposing 6'3" frame. The nervous tick in his left eye has become constant, giving him a ghastly, haunted appearance. He barely sleeps, barely eats, and spends his days signing death sentences for his army in the form of tactical orders that no longer matter. Outside his bunker, his men are eating their horses, their leather belts, anything to survive one more day. They huddle in basements without heat, without hope, waiting for the end they all know is coming. What makes this moment truly remarkable is not the defeat itself, though Stalingrad would become the turning point of World War II in Europe. It is who Friedrich Paulus was before he entered that bunker. This was not some reckless gambler or fanatic ideologue. Paulus was considered perhaps the finest staff officer in the entire German army, a master of logistics and planning, meticulous to the point of obsession. He had helped design Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He had orchestrated the encirclement at Kharkov just 8 months earlier, destroying 240,000 Soviet soldiers and capturing 1,200 tanks. His superiors praised his thoroughness, his attention to detail, his ability to coordinate vast armies across hundreds of miles. Field Marshal von Rundstedt called him an outstanding staff officer. Hitler himself trusted Paulus's judgment enough to give him command of the army that would deliver the decisive blow in the 1942 summer offensive. Yet here he sits, presiding over the greatest German military disaster since Napoleon retreated from Moscow. The path from triumph to catastrophe took exactly 6 months. In late June of 1942, Paulus's Sixth Army had jumped off from positions east of Kharkov, spearheading Case Blue, Germany's grand offensive to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut the Soviet Union's economic lifeline. The advance was spectacular. 400 kilometers in 8 weeks, Soviet forces retreating rather than standing to fight, German columns racing toward the Volga River with minimal resistance. On August 23rd, the 16th Panzer Division reached the Volga north of Stalingrad at 6:35 in the evening, cutting Soviet communications and seemingly winning the race. Paulus stood on the west bank of the river that September, looking through his binoculars at the smoking city across the water. He believed victory was 48 hours away. Officers around him were already planning the victory parade. The industrial city of Stalingrad, a prestige target bearing Stalin's name, would fall within days. Then the Sixth Army would pivot south to support the drive into the Caucasus, and the war in the east would be decided. But Stalingrad did not fall in 48 hours. It did not fall in 48 days. The city became a meat grinder that consumed German tactical advantages like fuel thrown on a fire. Urban combat reduced the Wehrmacht's vaunted combined arms coordination to brutal room-to-room fighting where Soviet defenders could negate German air superiority and artillery dominance. Buildings changed hands 5 or 6 times in a single day. Companies that began September with 180 men ended October with 30. Battalions were reduced to the strength of platoons. Divisions that should have numbered 15,000 men could barely muster 2,000 combat-effective soldiers. Yet Paulus kept feeding his units into the city, convinced that one more push would break Soviet resistance. By early November, he had committed all 13 of his divisions simultaneously into the urban combat. He had no operational reserves. Every man was on the line, fighting for factories and apartment blocks whose names would become synonymous with slaughter. The Red October Factory, the Barricade Factory, the Tractor Factory, Mamayev Kurgan. While Paulus fixated on capturing the last few hundred meters of riverbank, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov was planning something entirely different. Zhukov understood that Stalingrad itself didn't matter. The city was bait, drawing in German forces and pinning them in place while Soviet armies massed on the flanks. Throughout October and early November, over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 13,000 guns, and 1,400 tanks moved into positions northwest and southeast of Stalingrad, hidden in forests and ravines. German intelligence detected the build-up, but underestimated it by half. More critically, the Sixth Army's flanks were held not by German divisions, but by Romanian armies equipped with obsolete weapons and inadequate anti-tank guns. Paulus knew this. He had sent urgent warnings to Army Group headquarters, requesting permission to withdraw from Stalingrad to shorten his lines and create reserves. Permission was denied. Hitler insisted that not 1 meter of ground could be abandoned. The Führer was obsessed with Stalingrad's symbolic value, convinced that capturing the city bearing Stalin's name would break Soviet morale and secure Germany's southern flank. On November 19th at 7:30 in the morning, 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously on the Romanian Third Army northwest of Stalingrad. The barrage lasted 80 minutes, pulverizing defensive positions and shattering Romanian morale before a single Soviet tank moved forward. When the armor came, it came in overwhelming force. The 5th Tank Army smashed through the Romanian lines like a fist through wet paper. Romanian infantry fled en masse, abandoning their positions, their weapons, their wounded. German reserve units, the 48th Panzer Corps, attempted to counterattack, but were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. The Southern Pincer launched the next day against the Romanian 4th Army with identical results. Soviet tank columns drove deep into the German rear, racing toward the town of Calac-on-Don, where the 6th Army's main supply bridge crossed the Don River. On November 23rd, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Soviet forces met at Calac. The trap was closed. 265,000 men were encircled in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers east to west and 40 kilometers north to south. Paulus received confirmation that evening. He immediately called an emergency conference with his corps commanders. What happened in that conference room would determine the fate of 250,000 men. Every corps commander argued for immediate breakout. General Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commanding the 51st Corps, was most adamant. They had 48 hours, perhaps 72, before the Soviet ring solidified and became impenetrable. The army must abandon its heavy equipment, gather what fuel and ammunition remained, and smash through the weakest point in the encirclement before Soviet reinforcements arrived. They would take heavy casualties, perhaps 50,000 men, but half the army could be saved. Paulus listened to all arguments. He agreed with the logic, but he would not give the order, not without permission from Hitler. This was the moment that defined Friedrich Paulus's career and character. He was constitutionally incapable of disobeying orders, even when those orders guaranteed disaster. His entire career had been built on meticulous obedience, on being the perfect staff officer who executed plans brilliantly, but never questioned the strategic assumptions behind them. He told his commanders they would wait for the Führer's decision. Hitler's decision arrived on November 24th. The Sixth Army will form hedgehog defense and await relief. The Luftwaffe will supply the pocket. Stand fast. The order was based on Hermann Göring's promise to supply the pocket by air, delivering 550 tons of supplies daily. Luftwaffe officers immediately protested this was impossible. They had perhaps 500 transport aircraft available, needed 750. The distance from the nearest German airfields to the pocket was 200 kilometers. Weather in the Russian winter made flying conditions unpredictable at best, suicidal at worst. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns would savage the lumbering transport planes. The mathematics of the airlift were simple and damning. It couldn't work. But Göring, desperate to restore the Luftwaffe's prestige after recent failures, insisted it could be done. Hitler believed him because he wanted to believe. The alternative, abandoning Stalingrad, was psychologically impossible for the Führer. Paulus received the order and acknowledged it without protest. His chief of staff, Schmidt, reinforced the decision, arguing that abandoning Stalingrad would disgrace German military honor. The Sixth Army would stand fast and await relief. By the time Paulus received his final promotion to Field Marshal on January 30th, 1943, the gesture was sickeningly transparent. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler was trying to compel Paulus to suicide rather than capitulation. Now, on the morning of January 31st, in that freezing basement bunker, Paulus faces the moment Hitler tried to prevent. A Soviet officer enters, accompanied by translators and guards. The scene is surreally polite. There are bows, formal introductions, translation difficulties. Paulus signs documents with his shaking hand. He is now a prisoner, the first German Field Marshal to surrender in Prussian and German military history. Above ground, his surviving soldiers stumbled towards Soviet lines, some carried by comrades too weak to walk themselves. They look like animated corpses, hollow-eyed and skeletal, wrapped in blankets and scraps of carpet torn from ruins. Of the 91,000 who surrender, only 6,000 will survive Soviet captivity to return home. The Sixth Army has been annihilated. And the man who led them into the trap, who refused to break out when escape was possible, who obeyed orders even as those orders murdered his army, will spend the next 10 years in Soviet captivity contemplating the price of obedience. The question that would haunt historians for decades was simple and terrible. How did the Wehrmacht's finest staff officer become the architect of Germany's greatest defeat? September 1917. The Italian Alps, near Tolmain. A young Prussian lieutenant named Friedrich Paulus stands in a cramped command post, studying maps by candlelight while artillery rumbles in the distance. He is 26 years old, serving with the elite Alpenkorps, Germany's specialized mountain warfare unit. Outside, the 12th Battle of the Isonzo is about to begin, an Austro-German offensive that will smash through Italian lines and nearly knock Italy out of World War I. Paulus isn't leading an assault company over the mountains. He's not commanding machine gun positions or directing mortar fire. He is doing what he does best: staff work. Planning supply routes through treacherous mountain passes, calculating ammunition requirements for artillery batteries operating at high altitude, coordinating the movement of thousands of troops through terrain where a single misjudgment means columns stuck on narrow trails with nowhere to go. His work is invisible to the soldiers who will attack at dawn, but without it, their attack would fail before it began. This is the foundation of Friedrich Paulus's military career: excellence in the unglamorous machinery of war. Unlike the aristocratic Prussian officers who dominated the German general staff, Paulus came from humble origins. Born September 23, 1890, in the small Hessian town of Guxhagen, he was the son of a schoolteacher. His family had no military tradition, no inherited connections to the officer corps, no automatic entry into the Prussian elite. Paulus would have to earn every promotion, prove himself worthy at every step. He joined the army in 1910 as an officer cadet in the 111th Infantry Regiment, a respectable but unremarkable unit. What he lacked in aristocratic pedigree, he compensated for with relentless diligence. He was meticulously organised, obsessively prepared, and constitutionally incapable of producing sloppy work. These traits made him an excellent staff officer, but revealed something deeper. Paulus's entire identity was built on being useful, being indispensable, being the man superiors could rely upon absolutely. World War I gave Paulus the opportunity to demonstrate his gifts. He served continuously from 1914 to 1918, but almost never in frontline combat command. He was too valuable behind the scenes, coordinating logistics, planning operations, ensuring that supplies reached the front and casualties made it to aid stations. The Alpencorps' deployment to Italy was typical, brilliant planning, enabling spectacular tactical success. The breakthrough at Caporetto in October 1917, where Austro-German forces advanced 90 miles in 2 weeks and captured 275,000 Italian prisoners, was a triumph of staff work as much as combat prowess. Officers like Paulus made it possible. He emerged from World War I with an Iron Cross and a reputation as an officer who got things done efficiently, quietly, and without drama. In the chaotic years of the Weimar Republic, when the German army was reduced to 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles, these qualities ensured Paulus's survival in the officer corps. The interwar years shaped Paulus into the archetype of the German General Staff officer. He attended the elite Kriegsakademie in Berlin, where he studied military history, logistics, and operational planning, alongside the men who would lead Germany's armies in the next war. He married Elena Constance Rossetti Salescu, a Romanian aristocrat, in 1912, a union that brought him social prestige and exposed him to broader European culture. Paulus became fluent in French and Romanian, unusual for a German officer and indicative of his cosmopolitan sophistication. Physically, he was striking. 6 feet 3 inches tall, slender, elegant in his bearing. He dressed impeccably, changing uniforms multiple times daily, bathing 3 times a day, maintaining an almost obsessive standard of personal grooming. Colleagues described him as aristocratic in manner, despite his middle-class origins. But beneath the refined exterior was a man of rigid habits and compulsive need for order. His daily routine was invariable. Awakening at 5 a.m., calisthenics, cold bath, breakfast precisely on schedule, work beginning at 6:30. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 and began rebuilding Germany's military, officers like Paulus were essential. He was apolitical, not enthusiastically Nazi, but willing to serve the regime without moral objection. This willingness, shared by most of the officer corps, would prove catastrophic. Throughout the 1930s, Paulus held various staff positions, each more responsible than the last. In 1939, he was Chief of Staff to General Walther von Reichenau's 10th Army during the invasion of Poland. The campaign was a revelation of modern warfare, tanks and aircraft working in coordination, traditional defences swept aside by mobile operations. Paulus's logistical planning was flawless. The 10th Army advanced hundreds of kilometres in weeks, encircled Warsaw, and forced Polish surrender in 27 days. Von Reichenau, a mentor to Paulus and one of the few senior officers enthusiastic about Nazism, praised his Chief of Staff's work extensively. It was the beginning of a partnership that would define the next phase of Paulus's career. The 1940 campaign in France elevated Paulus to the highest levels of operational planning. Still serving as von Reichenau's Chief of Staff, now with the 6th Army, Paulus helped orchestrate the breakthrough that shattered French defences and led to the evacuation at Dunkirk. The campaign showcased both his strengths and his critical weakness. The plan was brilliant, the execution meticulous, the coordination of multiple corps across difficult terrain exemplary. But when Hitler issued his controversial stop order on May 24th, halting the advance toward Dunkirk and allowing 338,000 Allied soldiers to escape, Paulus executed the order without question. He did not protest, did not argue that continuing the advance would destroy the British Expeditionary Force, did not push back against a decision that would haunt Germany for the rest of the war. He simply obeyed. Field Marshal von Rundstedt later observed that Paulus was perhaps the best staff officer in the German army, but privately questioned whether he possessed the hardness necessary for independent field command. It was a prescient doubt. Paulus's reward for success in France was promotion to Deputy Chief of the General Staff for Operations in September 1940. He was now working directly under Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, in the nerve centre of German military planning. His primary responsibility, planning the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa would be the greatest military undertaking in history, requiring coordination of 3 million men, 3,300 tanks, 7,200 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The operational challenges were staggering. Soviet territory was vast, with few paved roads and primitive infrastructure. The railway system used a different gauge than German railroads, requiring either conversion or transshipment at the border. Distances were unlike anything encountered in Western Europe. From the German border to Moscow was roughly the same distance as from the German border to the Spanish border. Paulus threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity, producing detailed plans for supply routes, ammunition stockpiles, fuel requirements, and casualty evacuation procedures. But planning Barbarossa revealed the limits of technical excellence divorced from strategic wisdom. In December 1940, Paulus conducted a war game at German headquarters to test the invasion plan. He played Red, commanding Soviet forces, while other officers commanded German units. The results were ominous. Paulus demonstrated that if Soviet forces traded space for time, retreating deeper into their vast territory while destroying infrastructure, German supply lines would become dangerously overextended. The Wehrmacht's logistics could support an advance to a line running roughly from Arkhangelsk in the north to Astrakhan in the south, the so-called AA line. But only if the campaign concluded in 12 to 16 weeks, any longer, and the army would outrun its supplies. German petroleum stockpiles were especially inadequate for sustained operations beyond 500 kilometres. Paulus's own war game showed that Barbarossa's fundamental assumption that the Red Army would be destroyed in front of the Dnieper River in 6 to 8 weeks was essential for success. If that assumption proved wrong, the entire invasion could collapse. These warnings were noted in staff reports but did not change the plan. Hitler was convinced that the Soviet Union would collapse from internal weakness once the initial battles were won. He dismissed concerns about logistics and depth, insisting that the campaign would be over by autumn. Paulus had done his duty by raising the issues. When his concerns were overruled, he did not press them. He refined the plans, conducted staff rides along the Soviet border to survey the terrain, and prepared the Wehrmacht for an invasion his own analysis suggested was dangerously flawed. On March 30th, 1941, Paulus was present at Hitler's infamous speech to 250 senior officers, where the Führer declared that the coming war in the East would be a war of extermination. Political commissars were to be shot upon capture. Civilian resistance would be met with collective reprisals. The rules of warfare as understood by the traditional officer corps would not apply. Paulus sat in that audience and said nothing. He did not object. He did not resign. He went back to his maps and logistics tables and continued planning an invasion that would become a genocide. On June 22nd, 1941, 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union at dawn. Paulus watched from headquarters as the reports flooded in. Spectacular advances, hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners, entire armies encircled and destroyed. For months, it seemed his careful planning had enabled the greatest military victory in history. But as autumn approached and Soviet resistance stiffened, as German spearheads stalled before Moscow in December, the flaws Paulus had identified in his war game became catastrophic reality. The Wehrmacht had not destroyed the Red Army in 6 weeks. Soviet forces had traded space for time, German logistics were collapsing under the strain of distance and winter weather. The invasion was failing. In May 1942, Paulus left his staff position to take field command of the Sixth Army, replacing the suddenly deceased Field Marshal von Reichenau. He had spent his entire career as the perfect staff officer, executing orders brilliantly while never questioning the wisdom of those orders. Now, he would lead 300,000 men in combat, responsible not for plans but for lives. The appointment would prove to be the greatest tragedy of his life and the death sentence for his army. The perfect staff officer was about to discover that excellence in planning was not the same as wisdom in command. December 5th, 1940. The map room at Zossen, 15 miles south of Berlin, headquarters of the German Army High Command. Major General Friedrich Paulus stands before an enormous map of Eastern Europe, placing coloured pins that represent armies, corps, and divisions. 3 great arrows thrust eastward from the German-Soviet border, each representing an army group that will smash into the Soviet Union in the greatest invasion in military history. Army Group North will drive toward Leningrad, Army Group Center will strike toward Moscow. Army Group South will sweep into Ukraine, capturing the breadbasket and industrial heartland of the Soviet Empire. Paulus is Deputy Chief of the General Staff for Operations, responsible for transforming Adolf Hitler's strategic vision into executable military plans. The invasion, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, is scheduled for May 1941, just 5 months away. Every detail must be perfect. Supply routes, ammunition stockpiles, fuel requirements, bridging equipment, medical facilities. The scope is staggering, and Paulus is the man making it work. The genesis of Barbarossa lay in Hitler's ideological obsessions and strategic calculations. The Führer had always intended to destroy the Soviet Union, viewing Bolshevism as Germany's mortal enemy and Soviet territory as Lebensraum, living space for German expansion. After conquering France in 6 weeks, during the summer of 1940, Hitler turned his attention eastward. Britain refused to surrender, but without a continental ally, the British were contained. The Soviet Union, however, represented both threat and opportunity. Stalin's Red Army was massive but had performed poorly in the 1939 Winter War against Finland. German intelligence, reading the same combat reports everyone else saw, concluded that Soviet military leadership was incompetent, Soviet equipment obsolete, and Soviet morale fragile. One good blow, Hitler believed, and the rotten structure would collapse. Paulus's job was to deliver that blow through meticulous operational planning. The planning process revealed both Paulus's technical brilliance and his moral blindness. He assembled a staff of Germany's finest logisticians and operational planners, working 16-hour days to solve unprecedented challenges. How do you supply 3 million men advancing across territory with few paved roads and primitive infrastructure? The answer involved careful calculation of fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure based on expected combat intensity, and food requirements accounting for limited local resources. Paulus calculated that each infantry division required 200 tons of supplies daily during active operations. Panzer divisions needed 300 tons. Multiply that across 145 divisions, and the Wehrmacht needed to move over 30,000 tons of supplies daily to maintain offensive momentum. Soviet railways used a wider gauge than German rail systems, meaning captured Soviet rail lines either had to be converted to German gauge or supplies transshipped at the border. Both options created bottlenecks that would worsen the deeper into Soviet territory the armies advanced. In December 1940, Paulus organized a war game to test the invasion, plans, feasibility. The exercise, conducted at Zossen over several days, assigned Paulus to command Soviet forces, while other staff officers commanded German units. The purpose was to identify potential problems before they occurred in real combat. What happened during that war game should have changed history. Paulus, playing the Red Army, demonstrated that Soviet forces could avoid decisive encirclements by conducting strategic retreats, trading space for time while destroying infrastructure to deny it to advancing Germans. If the Soviets refused to stand and fight in the border regions, German armies would advance into an empty void, their supply lines lengthening dangerously while Soviet forces regrouped in the interior. Paulus calculated that German logistics could support operations to a theoretical line from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan, the AA line, but only if the campaign concluded within 12 to 16 weeks. Fighting beyond that time frame or distance would outstrip German supply capabilities. The warnings went into staff reports, were duly noted, and then were essentially ignored. Hitler and the senior leadership were convinced that the Red Army would collapse quickly once border defences were breached. They pointed to Soviet performance in Finland, to Stalin's purges of the officer corps in 1937 and 38, to the apparent disorganisation of Soviet forces. Moreover, the Führer's ideological beliefs coloured all analysis. He insisted that the Judeo-Bolshevik state was inherently weak, held together only by terror, and would shatter once German forces demonstrated their superiority. Hard logistical facts about petroleum supplies and railway gauge were dismissed as pessimism. Paulus had done his duty by raising concerns. When those concerns were overruled, he returned to refining the plan rather than pressing the issue. This pattern, professional competence without moral courage, would define his career. The plan that emerged from months of staff work was operationally sophisticated and strategically dubious. 3 army groups would launch simultaneous offensives along a front stretching 1,200 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The initial assault would employ 3,800 tanks, 7,200 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft supporting 3 million troops. The northern thrust toward Leningrad would cut off the Baltic states and link up with Finnish forces. The central thrust would drive straight toward Moscow, aiming to capture the Soviet capital and destroy the heart of Soviet command and control. The southern thrust would overrun Ukraine, seizing its agricultural production and capturing the Donetsk Basin industrial region. Speed was essential. Barbarossa had to conclude before winter. German forces lacked winter clothing, winter lubricants for vehicles, and winter training. The entire operation assumed a rapid campaign ending in Soviet collapse by autumn 1941. Paulus personally conducted reconnaissance of the invasion assembly areas in spring 1941. He travelled to East Prussia and occupied Poland, surveying the terrain, inspecting supply depots, and consulting with commanders whose units would lead the assault. He saw the massive build-up firsthand. Tens of thousands of trucks forming motor pools that stretched for miles, rail yards crammed with locomotives and freight cars, ammunition dumps containing millions of artillery shells, fuel depots stockpiling petroleum products that represented a substantial portion of Germany's strategic reserves. The Wehrmacht was betting everything on Barbarossa's success. If the invasion failed, Germany would lack the resources for another attempt. Paulus understood the stakes, yet he never questioned whether the entire enterprise was wise. He was an instrument of policy, not a maker of policy. His role was to make Barbarossa work, not to judge whether it should happen. March 30th, 1941. The new Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Hitler summoned approximately 250 senior Wehrmacht officers to the Marble Gallery for a special briefing on the coming invasion. Paulus was among them, seated in the audience as the Führer spoke for 2.5 hours about the nature of the war Germany was about to wage. This would not be a conventional conflict bound by international law and military tradition. The coming struggle was ideological, a war of annihilation against Judeo-Bolshevism. Soviet political commissars embedded with Red Army units were to be shot immediately upon capture, not treated as prisoners of war. Civilian resistance would be met with collective reprisals against entire villages. The war would be savage and ruthless because the enemy was savage and ruthless. Hitler's speech shocked some officers present, men raised in Prussian military traditions that emphasized honor and adherence to the laws of war, but most, including Paulus, accepted the Führer's framing without public objection. The Commissar Order, issued in writing on June 6, 1941, formalized Hitler's instructions. It directed that Soviet political commissars were not to be treated as soldiers and were to be dispatched immediately after capture. This was a direct order to commit murder, a violation of the Geneva Conventions that Germany had signed. Senior officers, including Paulus, received this order and distributed it to their subordinate commands. Some generals, like Fedor von Bock, would quietly ignore it or instruct their units to interpret it narrowly. Others enforced it enthusiastically. Paulus, characteristically, did not protest, did not resign, and did not use his position as Deputy Chief of the General Staff to argue against a criminal directive. He processed the Commissar order through normal channels, like any other operational instruction. Decades later, historians would debate the extent of the Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes. Paulus's role in planning Barbarossa and distributing criminal orders like the Commissar order made him complicit, regardless of his later claims of ignorance or disapproval. June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 a.m. Operation Barbarossa began with a massive artillery barrage along the entire front, followed by airstrikes against Soviet airfields. Within hours, 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most caught on the ground. German armour poured across the border, achieving complete tactical surprise despite months of intelligence warnings Stalin had ignored. For Paulus, watching from Zossen as situation reports flooded in, the first days seemed to validate every assumption. Army group centres, panzer groups, encircled 323,000 Soviet soldiers at Minsk in the first week. Army Group South smashed through Soviet defences in Ukraine. Army Group North raced toward Leningrad. The map pins Paulus moved westward. Each morning showed spectacular advances, sometimes 40 miles in a single day. By mid-July, German forces had penetrated 300 miles into Soviet territory, captured 600,000 prisoners, and destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft. But even in this moment of apparent triumph, the weaknesses Paulus had identified were manifesting. Soviet forces were retreating rather than standing to fight in hopeless encirclements. They were scorching the earth as they withdrew, destroying bridges, rail lines, and supply depots. German supply columns struggled to keep pace with advancing spearheads. Distances that looked manageable on maps became exhausting in reality. Roads that appeared on German maps as solid lines were often dirt tracks that became impassable mud after rain. Fuel consumption exceeded projections as tanks and trucks burned petroleum traversing terrible terrain. By August, some panzer divisions were immobilized for days awaiting fuel deliveries. Paulus saw the logistics reports showing declining operational readiness, increasing maintenance backlogs, and lengthening supply lines. The Wehrmacht was winning tactically while losing operationally, exactly as his war game had predicted. Yet, when the invasion stalled before Moscow in December 1941, defeated by Soviet resistance, exhaustion, and winter weather, Paulus did not say, "I warned them." He did not point to his prescient war game or his careful calculations showing the limits of German logistics. He accepted the planning of a flawed operation as his professional duty and bore no apparent guilt for the hundreds of thousands of deaths that resulted. In May 1942, he left his staff position to take field command of the 6th Army. He would now execute operations rather than plan them, leading men in combat rather than moving pins on maps. The brilliant staff officer who helped create Barbarossa would now experience firsthand the consequences of strategic overreach and ideological madness. And in the ruins of Stalingrad, Friedrich Paulus would discover that planning disasters from behind a desk was very different from dying in them at the front. The architect of Barbarossa was about to become its most famous victim. January 17, 1942. A hospital room in Poltava, Ukraine, 500 miles behind the front lines. Field Marshal Walther von Reichenau, commander of the German 6th Army, lies in a coma, his robust frame suddenly and catastrophically failing. 5 days earlier, on January 12th, the 57-year-old commander had gone for his daily morning jog despite sub-zero temperatures and warnings from his staff. Reichenau was famous for his physical fitness, jogging several miles each morning regardless of weather. But that morning, in temperatures approaching minus 20 degrees Celsius, he collapsed mid-run, suffering a massive stroke. Now he is dying, and with him dies the question of who will inherit Germany's most important field army. Hitler, receiving news of the collapse, immediately begins considering replacements. The 6th Army, positioned to lead the summer offensive that will decide the war in Russia, needs a new commander. The choice will change the course of World War II. The man Hitler selects is Major General Friedrich Paulus, currently Deputy Chief of the General Staff, a brilliant planner who has never commanded anything larger than a battalion in combat. The decision to give Paulus command of the 6th Army was not inevitable or obvious. Other candidates had stronger claims. Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist commanded the 1st Panzer Army and had vast experience in mobile operations. General Walther Model was considered one of the Wehrmacht's most capable field commanders, aggressive and adaptable. General Hermann Hoth commanded the 4th Panzer Army with distinction. All had commanded large formations in combat, all had demonstrated the independence and decision-making ability required for army command. But Hitler rejected them for various reasons, mostly related to their willingness to question his strategic directives. Von Kleist had argued for withdrawing from exposed positions during the winter crisis. Model had repeatedly requested permission for tactical retreats to save his units. Hoth had openly criticised the decision to split forces between Moscow and Ukraine in autumn 1941. Hitler wanted commanders who would execute orders without debate, who would show the ideological commitment and personal loyalty he valued above military competence. Paulus fit that profile perfectly. He was apolitical enough not to be threateningly fanatical, but obedient enough never to challenge Hitler's authority. His work planning Barbarossa had impressed the Führer, who appreciated Paulus's attention to detail and professional competence. More importantly, Paulus had been protégé and chief of staff to Reichenau, one of the few senior Wehrmacht officers who genuinely supported National Socialism. Reichenau had advocated for Wehrmacht involvement in Nazi policies, including the murder of Jews and political commissars. His sudden death created a vacancy in an army whose officer corps largely shared his political reliability. Paulus seemed a natural successor, a technically brilliant officer who could be trusted to follow orders without moral qualms. On January 20th, 1942, Hitler signed the order promoting Paulus to Generaloberst, Colonel General, and giving him command of the 6th Army. Paulus received notification while still working in the Army High Command headquarters. He had less than a week to transition from planning operations for the entire Eastern Front to commanding a single army in the field. When Paulus arrived at 6th Army headquarters in Kharkov on January 20th, he inherited an army exhausted from 5 months of winter combat. The German invasion had been stopped before Moscow in December, and Soviet counteroffensives had pushed Wehrmacht forces back across a broad front. The 6th Army, holding a 180-kilometre sector in eastern Ukraine, consisted of 23 divisions with approximately 270,000 men. But these numbers disguised the army's weakened state. Infantry divisions that should have numbered 15,000 men were down to 8 or 9,000. Panzer divisions that began Barbarossa with 200 tanks now fielded 30 or 40 operational vehicles. Soldiers were suffering from frostbite, exhaustion, and low morale after the shock of Soviet resistance and winter warfare for which they were unprepared. Equipment was breaking down faster than repair facilities could fix it. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles through partisan-infested territory where trains and convoys faced constant ambush. Paulus imposed his rigid organizational style immediately. He established strict daily routines, demanded detailed written reports from all subordinate commands, and personally reviewed logistics tables and casualty returns. His headquarters staff, accustomed to Reichenau's informal and aggressive leadership style, found themselves working under a commander who operated more like a chief accountant than a battlefield general. Paulus brought with him Major General Arthur Schmidt as his chief of staff. Schmidt was a true believer in National Socialism, a hardliner who valued ideological commitment above military pragmatism. The partnership between Paulus and Schmidt would prove catastrophic. Schmidt reinforced Paulus's worst tendencies: his reluctance to make decisions without higher approval, his compulsive obedience to Hitler's orders, his inability to adapt when circumstances demanded flexibility. Together, they created a command team brilliant at administration but fatally flawed in operational judgment. Paulus's first weeks in command revealed both his strengths and limitations. He conducted thorough inspections of frontline units, visiting divisions to assess their condition and needs. What he saw appalled him. Soldiers were living in makeshift shelters, often just holes in the frozen ground covered with canvas or corrugated metal. Frostbite casualties in some units exceeded combat casualties. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, with wounded men lying in unheated buildings because there was insufficient fuel for stoves. Equipment that functioned perfectly in Western Europe froze solid in Russian winters. Rifle bolts seized up, vehicle engines wouldn't start without hours of preheating, artillery recoil mechanisms cracked in the cold. Paulus documented all these problems in detailed reports to Army Group South, his immediate superior headquarters. The reports were models of staff work, precise, comprehensive, actionable. But they revealed a man more comfortable describing problems than solving them, more inclined to wait for guidance than to exercise independent initiative. The true test came in May 1942 with the Second Battle of Kharkov. Soviet Marshal Semyon Timoshenko launched a massive offensive aimed at recapturing Kharkov and breaking through into the Donetsk Basin. 640,000 Soviet troops, 1,200 tanks, and 1,300 aircraft attacked on May 12th, smashing into German defensive positions. The offensive achieved initial success, creating a huge bulge in German lines south of Kharkov. For Paulus, commanding in his first major battle, the situation was both crisis and opportunity. The Soviet spearhead was overextended, vulnerable to encirclement if German forces could coordinate attacks from north and south to cut off the salient. Paulus saw the opportunity immediately, his staff officer's eye recognizing the classic double envelopment geometry. But he hesitated to act. On May 17th, with the Soviet offensive stalling from exhaustion and overextension, Paulus had the perfect moment to order his reserves into a counterattack. His subordinate commanders were urging him to commit. Intelligence reports showed Soviet forces low on fuel and ammunition. The weather was clear, permitting German air superiority to devastate exposed Soviet columns. Everything Paulus knew about operational art told him to attack now, but he didn't give the order. Instead, he requested permission from Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group South. Paulus wanted confirmation, wanted assurance that higher authority approved his plan, wanted someone else to share responsibility for the decision. The delay nearly proved fatal. Soviet forces came within miles of breaking through to Kharkov before von Bock, exasperated by Paulus's hesitation, personally ordered the 6th Army to attack immediately. Von Bock's order arrived on May 19th, and Paulus finally committed his reserves. The resulting encirclement, conducted jointly by 6th Army from the north and 1st Panzer Army under von Kleist from the south, was a tactical masterpiece. German pincers closed around the Soviet bulge near Barvenkovo on May 23rd, trapping an enormous Soviet force in a pocket 30 miles across. Over the next 5 days, German forces systematically destroyed the encircled units. By May 28th, when Soviet resistance finally collapsed, the Wehrmacht had captured 239,000 prisoners, destroyed 1,249 tanks, and captured 2,026 artillery pieces. It was one of the greatest German victories on the Eastern Front, and Paulus received full credit for commanding the 6th Army during the triumph. Hitler sent personal congratulations. The victory seemed to validate Paulus's appointment to field command and confirmed the Führer's faith in obedient, ideologically reliable officers over independently minded field commanders. But the men who fought the battle drew different conclusions. Von Bock noted in his diary that Paulus had shown disturbing hesitation at the critical moment, requiring direct orders to execute an operation his own training should have told him was necessary. Von Kleist, whose 1st Panzer Army had provided the mobile striking power for the encirclement, privately questioned how much credit Paulus deserved versus his more aggressive subordinate corps commanders. Most critically, the victory taught Paulus exactly the wrong lesson. The success at Kharkov convinced him that Hitler's strategy of refusing retreats and standing fast was correct. The Führer had emphasized after the winter crisis that German forces must never again fall back. That holding ground was psychologically essential to maintaining morale and denying the Soviets any sense of momentum. Kharkov seemed to prove this. Soviet forces had attacked, been stopped, and then destroyed when German forces counterattacked from fortified positions. In Paulus's mind, the battle validated Hitler's operational instincts. As spring turned to summer, Paulus prepared his army for the coming offensive. Case Blue, Germany's 1942 summer campaign, would aim to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut off the Soviet Union's economic lifeline. The 6th Army would serve as the northern pincer of the operation, advancing eastward toward a city on the Volga River that bore Joseph Stalin's name. Paulus threw himself into the preparation with characteristic thoroughness, reviewing supply plans, inspecting units, ensuring every detail was addressed. He believed he was ready for whatever lay ahead. He had proven himself in combat at Kharkov, earned Hitler's confidence, and inherited command of one of the Wehrmacht's elite field armies. What he didn't yet understand was that Kharkov had been won despite his hesitation, not because of his leadership, and that the weakness von Bock had identified, the inability to act decisively without higher approval, would prove fatal when facing the desperate isolation of Encirclement. The accidental commander, the man who never should have led an army in the field, was about to lead his soldiers into a trap from which neither he nor they would escape. May 12, 1942. Dawn breaks cold and grey over the steppes southwest of Kharkov. German sentries in forward positions notice something strange. The usual morning quiet is absent, replaced by a distant rumble like continuous thunder. Then the horizon erupts. 6,300 Soviet artillery pieces and mortars open fire simultaneously, shells screaming overhead in a barrage that will last 90 minutes. The ground shakes, dugouts collapse. Communication wires are shredded. Men crouch in their positions, hands pressed to ears, waiting for the bombardment to end and the assault to begin. This is the opening of the Second Battle of Kharkov, and for General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the 6th Army for just 4 months, it will be his first real test as a field commander. 640,000 Soviet soldiers are attacking across a 60-mile front, aiming to smash through German lines, recapture Kharkov, and potentially collapse the entire southern sector of the Eastern Front. Within hours, Paulus will face the decision that defines command, whether to follow doctrine and wait for instructions or trust his judgment and act independently before it's too late. The Soviet offensive was Marshal Semyon Timoshenko's attempt to preempt German plans for summer 1942. Stalin and his high command knew the Wehrmacht was preparing a major offensive, though they misjudged its objectives, expecting another drive toward Moscow rather than the actual target of the Caucasus oil fields. Soviet strategy was to strike first, throw German forces off balance, and seize the initiative before the Wehrmacht could attack. The plan was ambitious, perhaps overly so. 2 Soviet army groups, the Southwest Front and Southern Front, would assault German positions southwest and south of Kharkov, break through the defences, and drive deep into German rear areas. The offensive employed 1,200 tanks, including the new KV-1 heavy tanks that German anti-tank guns struggled to penetrate. 1,300 aircraft would provide air support. If successful, the operation could recapture Ukraine's second-largest city and cut off Army Group South's logistics base. The initial Soviet attacks achieved significant penetration. German defensive positions, weakened by winter combat and not yet fully recovered, gave ground under overwhelming pressure. By the afternoon of May 12th, Soviet armoured spearheads had advanced 10 miles in some sectors. The 6th Army's intelligence staff reported at least 3 Soviet armies attacking, possibly 4, with more forces likely in reserve. Paulus, receiving these reports in his headquarters, recognised immediately that this was not a local attack, but a full offensive. He ordered his units to conduct fighting withdrawals to preserve combat strength while inflicting maximum casualties on advancing Soviet forces. This was textbook defensive doctrine. Trade space for time, channelize enemy advances into kill zones, and wait for the offensive to culminate before counterattacking. But following doctrine required confidence that higher command would approve, that resources would be available, that the overall situation permitted such tactics. Paulus had confidence in none of these things. Over the next 4 days, Soviet forces created a massive bulge in German lines south of Kharkov, penetrating nearly 50 miles deep and 25 miles wide. German units fell back, sometimes in good order, sometimes in confusion, and the situation map at 6th Army headquarters showed red Soviet arrows stabbing westward toward Kharkov itself. But Paulus's intelligence officers were identifying something interesting in the pattern of Soviet advances. The attacking forces were moving forward aggressively but not securing their flanks. Soviet logistics columns were stretched thin, fuel trucks struggling to keep pace with advancing tanks. Ammunition expenditure was enormously heavy, suggesting Soviet artillery was firing without the careful rationing that characterized German practice. Radio intercepts showed increasing desperation in Soviet command communications. orders demanding faster advances despite reports of exhaustion and mechanical breakdowns. The Soviet offensive was powerful but potentially fragile. May 17th, 1942, 5 days into the battle. This was the moment that would define Paulus's career and reveal his fundamental character flaw. His operations officer, presenting the morning briefing, laid out the situation with brutal clarity. Soviet forces had overextended. Their northern flank was exposed, held by weakened units that had outrun their supplies. Their southern flank was similarly vulnerable. Meanwhile, German forces, including von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army south of the Soviet Bulge, were positioned perfectly for a double envelopment. If 6th Army attacked from the north, while 1st Panzer Army attacked from the south, the two pincers could meet behind the Soviet spearhead, encircling perhaps 300,000 enemy troops. The operational geometry was perfect, the kind of opportunity staff officers dream about. Paulus studied the maps. He conferred with his corps commanders. Everyone agreed. This was the moment to strike. But Paulus would not give the order. Instead, he composed a message to Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group South. The message described the situation, outlined the opportunity, and requested permission to commit the 6th Army's reserves to a counteroffensive. Paulus wanted authorization before acting. He wanted confirmation that von Bock saw the situation the same way. He wanted someone else to share responsibility if the counterattack failed. This hesitation, this compulsive need for approval from higher authority, nearly proved catastrophic. While Paulus waited for von Bock's response, Soviet forces continued advancing. They came within artillery range of Kharkov. Elements of the Soviet 6th Army reached the outskirts of Zmiev, just 15 miles from the city centre. Soviet commanders, sensing victory, urged their exhausted troops forward 1 more mile, 1 more hour, promising that Kharkov was within grasp. Von Bock's response, when it arrived on the afternoon of May 17th, was scathing. The Field Marshal, a Prussian aristocrat of the old school who valued aggressive initiative, essentially ordered Paulus to stop asking for permission and start attacking. Von Bock authorized the commitment of reserves and coordinated with von Kleist to launch 1st Panzer Army's attack simultaneously. But a full day had been lost. Soviet forces had advanced closer to Kharkov. The encirclement would now be more difficult, requiring German forces to penetrate deeper into Soviet-held territory. Paulus's hesitation had allowed the enemy to strengthen their position and had put German success at greater risk. When Paulus finally gave the attack order on May 19th, his subordinate commanders moved with aggressive speed, as if compensating for their army commander's delay. The German counteroffensive was devastating. 6th Army's northern pincer, led by the 17th and 29th Corps, smashed into the exposed northern flank of the Soviet Bulge on May 19th. Simultaneously, von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army attacked from the south with 3 panzer divisions and motorized infantry. Soviet commanders, fixated on reaching Kharkov, initially dismissed these attacks as local counterattacks that could be contained. They were catastrophically wrong. German armour, fighting in the open steppe terrain that favoured mobile warfare, tore through Soviet defensive positions. Luftwaffe aircraft, achieving air superiority after the initial Soviet fighter sweeps, savaged Soviet supply columns and command posts. By May 22nd, German pincers were within 5 miles of meeting, threatening to trap the entire Soviet offensive force. Soviet Marshal Timoshenko, realizing his offensive had become a death trap, ordered a general withdrawal on May 22nd. But it was too late. German mobile units completed the encirclement near Barvenkovo on May 23rd, cutting off Soviet lines of retreat. Over 200,000 Soviet soldiers, along with hundreds of tanks and thousands of artillery pieces, were now surrounded in a pocket roughly 30 miles across. The trapped forces attempted to break out, launching desperate attacks against the German encirclement ring. Some small groups succeeded in escaping through gaps in German lines, but most were killed or captured in the systematic reduction of the pocket over the next 5 days. German artillery pounded Soviet positions continuously. Luftwaffe bombers struck troop concentrations. Panzer divisions crushed attempted breakouts. By May 28th, organised Soviet resistance had collapsed. The final tally was staggering: 239,000 306 Soviet prisoners, 1,249 tanks destroyed or captured, 2,026 artillery pieces taken, and uncounted thousands of Soviet soldiers killed in combat. It was one of the greatest German victories on the Eastern Front, comparable to the enormous encirclements of 1941. For the Wehrmacht, it seemed to prove that the Red Army, despite showing greater resilience than initially expected, could still be defeated through superior operational skill. For Paulus personally, it was vindication. He had commanded the Sixth Army in a major battle and achieved spectacular success. Hitler sent personal congratulations, praising Paulus's leadership and the Sixth Army's combat effectiveness. But the men who actually executed the battle saw things differently. Von Bock recorded in his private diary that Paulus had shown unnecessary hesitation at the critical moment on May 17th, requiring explicit orders to do what any competent army commander should have done immediately. Von Kleist, whose panzer forces had provided much of the mobile striking power, privately questioned whether Paulus truly deserved credit for a victory that resulted more from Soviet overextension than German brilliance. Several of Paulus's own corps commanders noted that once given clear orders, they had conducted the encirclement largely on their own initiative, with minimal guidance from army headquarters. The victory at Kharkov was real, but it was achieved despite Paulus's command style, not because of it. More dangerously, Kharkov taught Paulus exactly the wrong lessons. The battle seemed to validate Hitler's insistence on holding ground and refusing retreats. Soviet forces had attacked, been stopped, and then been destroyed when German forces counterattacked. In Paulus's mind, this proved that defensive steadfastness followed by calculated counteroffensive was the correct formula. He did not appreciate that Kharkov succeeded because German forces had traded space for time initially, pulling back to create the conditions for encirclement. He did not recognize that his success required a Soviet mistake, Timoshenko's overextension, that might not be repeated. Most critically, he internalized the idea that waiting for higher approval before acting was acceptable, that his hesitation had been vindicated because the attack ultimately succeeded. These misconceptions would prove fatal 6 months later in the frozen rubble of Stalingrad, where hesitation would doom his army and obedience would prove more deadly than any Soviet attack. For now, in late May 1942, Paulus basked in victory and prepared for the summer offensive. The Sixth Army was being reinforced, refitted, and ready to spearhead case. Blue, the drive toward the Volga and the Caucasus oil fields. Paulus believed he had proven himself as a field commander. He had earned Hitler's confidence, demonstrated his army's capabilities, and shown that the Wehrmacht could still win decisive victories in the east. The disasters of the winter were behind them. Summer would bring triumph. The road east, across the empty steppe toward a city on the Volga, seemed clear and inviting. Paulus could not know that he was marching his army toward annihilation, that the skills that won at Kharkov would fail catastrophically in Stalingrad's ruins, and that his greatest weakness, his inability to disobey even suicidal orders, would transform victory into the most famous defeat in modern military history. June 28th, 1942, 4:30 in the morning. Artillery crashes along a 300-mile front stretching from Kursk in the north to Taganrog on the Sea of Azov in the south. Operation Case Blue, Germany's summer offensive to decide the war in Russia, has begun. The Sixth Army, positioned near Kharkov, awaits the order to advance. General Friedrich Paulus stands in his command vehicle, studying maps as the first reports arrive from forward units. The initial objectives are modest: break through Soviet defensive positions, advance eastward toward the Don River, then pivot south to support the drive into the Caucasus oil fields. But within weeks, the mission will change. A city on the Volga River, an industrial center bearing Stalin's name, will become an obsession that consumes the Sixth Army and transforms a brilliant operational advance into strategic madness. For now, though, the mood is optimistic. After the triumph at Kharkov, German commanders believe they have regained the initiative. The summer of 1942 will erase the shame of the winter defeats. Victory seems inevitable. The initial advance exceeded all expectations. Soviet forces retreated rather than standing to fight, abandoning defensive positions that German intelligence had identified as heavily fortified. By evening, on June 28th, 6th Army spearheads had penetrated 15 miles with minimal casualties. The next day brought similar results: light contact, scattered resistance, and steady progress eastward. Paulus, receiving these reports, felt a mixture of satisfaction and puzzlement. This was nothing like the desperate fighting at Kharkov or the grinding battles of 1941. Soviet units seemed to be melting away before German advances, avoiding contact rather than accepting battle. German reconnaissance units found abandoned equipment, supply dumps, hastily evacuated, and defensive positions prepared but unoccupied. It was as if the Red Army was refusing to play its assigned role in the German operational plan. What Paulus didn't fully understand was that Soviet strategy had fundamentally changed. Stalin and his high command, learning from the catastrophic encirclements of 1941, had ordered a strategic retreat. Soviet forces would trade space for time, falling back to preserve their armies, while German logistics stretched thin across vast distances. The lesson of Barbarossa was clear. German operational skill could destroy Soviet armies that stood to fight in predictable locations, but couldn't replace losses in men and equipment at the rate needed for sustained offensive operations. If Soviet forces refused to be encircled, if they withdrew faster than Germans could advance, the Wehrmacht would eventually exhaust itself conquering empty territory. This was precisely what Paulus's own war game in December 1940 had predicted. But German commanders, intoxicated by visions of another summer of spectacular victories, interpreted Soviet withdrawals as weakness rather than strategy. By mid-July, the 6th Army had advanced 200 miles in 2 weeks, covering ground that would have taken months in 1941. But the advance was hollow. Casualties were light because there was little fighting. Prisoners were few because Soviet soldiers were escaping encirclement. Equipment captures were minimal because the Red Army was evacuating supplies before Germans arrived. Paulus's daily situation reports showed impressive progress on maps, but revealed a disturbing truth. The 6th Army was racing across empty steppe, burning fuel and accumulating mechanical breakdowns while achieving no decisive result. German intelligence estimated that Soviet forces in the region numbered at least 600,000 men, but the 6th Army was encountering perhaps 1/10 that number. Where were the rest? The answer was obvious but unpalatable. They were retreating intact, preserving their strength for battles yet to come. July 23, 1942. Hitler issued Führer Directive 45 from his field headquarters in Ukraine. The directive fundamentally altered Case Blue's objectives in ways that violated every principle of sound strategy. Originally, the offensive aimed to capture the Caucasus oil fields, with secondary operations to secure the Don River line and protect the northern flank. But Hitler, impatient with the methodical advance and convinced that Soviet forces were on the verge of collapse, split German forces between multiple objectives. Army Group A would continue south toward the Caucasus. Army Group B, including the 6th Army, would simultaneously capture Stalingrad on the Volga River. The city had minimal military value. It was an industrial centre producing tanks and artillery, but Soviet industry had already relocated most critical production facilities beyond the Urals. Stalingrad's real importance was symbolic. It bore Stalin's name, and Hitler became obsessed with capturing it. Paulus received the modified orders without protest. He did not point out that dividing forces between two objectives weakened both efforts. He did not argue that Stalingrad could be bypassed and isolated by cutting the Volga River north and south of the city. He did not question whether urban combat in a large industrial city was wise when German tactical advantages relied on mobile warfare in open terrain. He simply reorganized his forces for the new mission and continued advancing. This was the Paulus pattern: brilliant execution of orders combined with complete absence of strategic questioning. He was still the staff officer at heart, implementing decisions made by others, never asking whether those decisions made sense. His chief of staff, Arthur Schmidt, reinforced this mindset, emphasizing that the Führer's orders were to be obeyed without hesitation. Between them, Paulus and Schmidt created a command dynamic where doubt was interpreted as defeatism and obedience was the highest virtue. August 23, 1942, 6:35 in the evening. The 16th Panzer Division, racing ahead of the main 6th Army forces, reached the Volga River just north of Stalingrad. German soldiers stood on the high western bank, looking across the broad river at the Soviet positions on the eastern shore. They had reached the objective. The race to the Volga was won. Unit commanders radioed the achievement back to 6th Army headquarters, and Paulus immediately forwarded the news to Army Group and then to Hitler's headquarters. The Führer was ecstatic, convinced that Stalingrad's fall was imminent. Orders went out for victory celebrations to be prepared. German propaganda began crafting the narrative of the capture of Stalin's city. Paulus himself, usually restrained in his optimism, allowed himself to believe that the hardest part of the campaign was over. The 6th Army had advanced 400 kilometers in 8 weeks. Surely the final few kilometers into Stalingrad itself would take days, not weeks. But even as German commanders celebrated reaching the Volga, a catastrophe was unfolding in the city. On August 23rd and 24th, the Luftwaffe conducted massive bombing raids on Stalingrad, attempting to destroy Soviet defensive preparations and break civilian morale. Over 1,000 aircraft participated in the raids, dropping hundreds of tons of incendiary and high-explosive bombs. The city, built largely of wooden buildings with some brick and concrete structures, burned with apocalyptic intensity. Firestorms consumed entire neighborhoods. The petroleum storage tanks on the city's northern edge exploded, sending rivers of burning fuel through the streets. Approximately 40,000 civilians died in 48 hours, trapped in shelters or burned alive, fleeing through streets turned into furnaces. The Volga itself seemed to be on fire, burning petroleum floating on the water's surface. The bombing achieved the opposite of its intention. Rather than making Stalingrad indefensible, it created ideal conditions for urban defense. The rubble of destroyed buildings provided endless hiding places for defenders. The ruined streets channelized attacking forces into killing zones. The smoke and dust made German air superiority largely irrelevant, as pilots couldn't identify targets in the chaos below. Most critically, the bombing galvanized Soviet determination. Stalin issued Order 227, not one step back, decreeing that retreat from Stalingrad was treason punishable by death. Soviet soldiers were trapped between German attackers in front and Soviet execution squads behind. They would fight with the desperation of men who had no choice but victory or death. General Vasily Trikov, appointed to command the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, immediately grasped the tactical reality. His forces would hug the Germans, staying within 100 meters of German lines at all times, negating artillery and air support that couldn't be used without hitting German troops. September 12, 1942. Paulus stood on the western outskirts of Stalingrad, looking at the burning city through his binoculars. After weeks of optimism, doubt was beginning to creep into his calculations. The 6th Army's lead elements had been fighting for Stalingrad's outskirts for 2 weeks and had advanced barely 2 miles. Casualties were mounting steadily. Infantry companies that began August with 150 men were down to 80 or 90. Tank battalions that started with 50 operational vehicles reported 20 or 30. The Luftwaffe, despite flying thousands of sorties, couldn't suppress Soviet artillery firing from the far bank of the Volga. Most disturbing, Soviet resistance was intensifying rather than collapsing. Fresh divisions were being ferried across the Volga at night, replacing units destroyed during the day. For every block the 6th Army captured, the Soviets seemed to have another block prepared for defense. Yet Paulus never seriously considered alternatives to the direct assault. He could have bypassed Stalingrad entirely, crossing the Volga north and south of the city to isolate it without urban combat. He could have settled for a siege, surrounding the city and starving it into submission. He could have recommended to Hitler that Stalingrad wasn't worth the casualties it would cost. But he did none of these things. The orders were to capture Stalingrad, and Paulus would execute those orders regardless of cost. His staff, officers, veterans of Poland and France privately questioned the wisdom of the urban assault. German tactical doctrine emphasized mobile warfare, not street fighting. The Wehrmacht's advantages in coordination, combined arms integration, and battlefield mobility were all nullified in urban combat. But these concerns never reached Paulus in a form that would force him to reconsider his command style. Rigid and hierarchical, discouraged, dissenting opinions. As September progressed, the 6th Army's assault on Stalingrad intensified. More divisions were committed. artillery was brought forward to pound Soviet positions at point-blank range. Infantry attacked the same blocks repeatedly, taking horrific casualties for gains measured in meters. The city became a charnel house, where German operational excellence was ground down to brutal arithmetic. How many German lives for this factory, that apartment building, those 100 meters of rubble? Paulus, watching his army consumed by the city, never admitted that he had led his men into a trap. He maintained faith that one more assault would break Soviet resistance, that tomorrow's attack would finally crack the defense, that the next wave of reinforcements would tip the balance. He was still fighting the clean war of his staff officer, imagination, where plans executed properly led to predictable results. The reality, visible in every casualty report, was that Stalingrad was different. This was attrition, not maneuver. This was death, not glory. And Friedrich Paulus, the perfect staff officer, had no doctrine for this kind of war. September 13th, 1942, dawn breaks over Stalingrad, revealing a landscape that no longer resembles a city. The bombing raids of late August have transformed the urban area into a wilderness of rubble, smoke, and fire. Buildings stand as hollow shells, walls blown out, roofs collapsed, floors pancaked atop one another. The streets are impassable to vehicles, choked with debris, unexploded ordnance, and the bodies of civilians and soldiers alike. Into this nightmare, General Friedrich Paulus orders the main assault. The 51st Corps, commanded by General Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, will attack directly into central Stalingrad, aiming to capture the Mamiev Kurgan, Hill 102, the highest point in the city. From that commanding height, German artillery observers will direct fire onto Soviet positions throughout Stalingrad and across the Volga River. Simultaneously, the 14th Panzer Corps will strike toward the central landing stages on the Volga, cutting Soviet supply lines from the eastern bank. If successful, the assault will split Soviet defenses and collapse organized resistance within days. By noon, it will be clear that nothing about Stalingrad will proceed according to plan. The German assault crashed into Soviet positions with massive force. Artillery bombardment, heavier than anything yet seen in the battle, pounded Soviet defensive positions for 2 hours before infantry advanced. Luftwaffe bombers struck in waves, dropping 500-kilogram bombs into areas marked by frontline troops. Stukas screamed down in their characteristic dives, sirens wailing, to deliver pinpoint strikes against identified strongpoints. When the barrage lifted, German infantry moved forward, supported by tanks and assault guns, expecting to find Soviet defences shattered. Instead, they found soldiers emerging from cellars, rubble piles, and sewer tunnels, opening fire at ranges of 30 to 50 metres. Soviet defenders had survived the bombardment by going underground, sheltering in basements, connected by tunnels hand-dug through cellar walls. They hugged German lines so closely that artillery and airstrikes risked hitting German troops. This was General Chuikov's defensive doctrine made real. Negate German firepower advantages by fighting at knife-fighting range. The combat that developed was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. In Poland, France, and even during Barbarossa's opening months, German combined arms tactics had dominated. Armour, infantry, artillery, and aircraft worked together seamlessly, overwhelming opponents through superior coordination. But in Stalingrad's ruins, these advantages evaporated. Tanks couldn't maneuver in rubble-choked streets and were vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails thrown from upper floors or basements. Artillery observers couldn't identify targets in the smoke and dust. Infantry advances were canalized into predictable routes, where Soviet machine guns waited in prepared positions. Aircraft couldn't distinguish friend from enemy when the lines were separated by a single wall or floor. The Wehrmacht's technological and doctrinal superiority meant nothing here. Stalingrad reduced warfare to its most primitive form, men killing men at close range with whatever weapons came to hand. By September 14th, the pattern of fighting had emerged that would characterize the next 2 months. German units would assault a building, often spending an entire day taking a single structure. They would fight room to room, floor to floor, sometimes throwing grenades through holes in walls rather than using doors that were certainly booby-trapped. Casualties mounted horrifically. A company attacking a fortified apartment building might suffer 30% casualties taking the ground floor, another 20% reaching the second floor, and find the third floor held by Soviet soldiers, who had simply retreated upward and now rained grenades and automatic fire down stairwells. Even when Germans captured a building completely, Soviet forces would counterattack at night, filtering back through sewers or trenches dug through rubble, recapturing what had been lost during the day. Possession of buildings became meaningless. The same structures changed hands 5 or 6 times. The Mamayev kurgan became the symbol of Stalingrad's horror. The hill itself was not particularly impressive, rising only about 330 feet above the surrounding terrain. But it dominated the city, and both sides understood its tactical importance. German forces attacked the kurgan repeatedly throughout September and October. They captured it on September 14th, lost it to Soviet counterattacks on September 15th, recaptured it on September 16th, lost it again on September 18th. Each assault cost hundreds of casualties. The slopes became so saturated with shell fragments that the soil was later measured to contain 1,200 pieces of shrapnel per square metre. Trees were shredded to splinters, grass burned away completely. By October, the hill was a lunar landscape of overlapping craters, the earth churned by explosions until the original contours were unrecognisable. Soviet and German dead lay in heaps, sometimes used as protective barricades by soldiers fighting over the same ground. The human cost of this fighting defied comprehension. German infantry divisions that entered Stalingrad with 12,000 to 15,000 men were reduced to 3,000 to 4,000 within weeks. The 71st Infantry Division reported company strengths of 20 to 30 men, where 180 was standard. Battalion commanders were leading units that should have been platoons. Regimental headquarters commanded forces that should have been companies. The 6th Army's casualty reports, filed daily with meticulous German precision, told a story of systematic destruction. In September alone, the army suffered over 20,000 casualties. October brought another 22,000. The medical evacuation system, designed for mobile warfare where wounded could be quickly transported to rear area hospitals, collapsed under the strain. Field hospitals in Stalingrad operated in ruins without heat, electricity, or sufficient medical supplies. Wounded men lay in unheated cellars waiting days for treatment. Frostbite casualties, as temperatures dropped in October, began exceeding combat casualties in some units. Soviet losses were equally catastrophic. General Chuikov's 62nd Army was being destroyed and rebuilt repeatedly. Divisions ferried across the Volga with 10,000 men would be reduced to 1,000 or fewer within a week. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving in Stalingrad was calculated at 24 hours. Officers lasted only slightly longer. Junior lieutenants commanding rifle platoons had a life expectancy measured in days. Soviet reinforcement divisions were thrown into combat with minimal training, sometimes armed with obsolete weapons or sent into battle carrying only ammunition for soldiers who would die ahead of them. The Volga River crossing became a nightly horror, ferries and barges dodging German artillery and airstrikes to deliver soldiers and supplies. Many vessels were hit, sinking with hundreds of men aboard. Those who made it across faced German fire from the moment they stepped onto the western bank, yet Soviet resistance never broke. This was the fundamental miscalculation that would doom the 6th Army. Paulus and his staff believed that every assault weakened Soviet capabilities, that eventually the defenders would reach a breaking point and collapse. German intelligence estimated Soviet forces in Stalingrad at 50,000 men and calculated that the current casualty rate would eliminate effective resistance by mid-October. But the estimates were wrong. Soviet command was pouring reinforcements into Stalingrad faster than Germans could destroy them. Fresh divisions arrived nightly from staging areas on the Volga's eastern bank. Ammunition and food came across the river in volumes sufficient to sustain the defence. Most critically, Soviet morale, paradoxically, was strengthening rather than weakening. Defenders knew they were holding the line against fascism at a place that bore Stalin's name. Retreat was forbidden by orders that would see deserters shot. The defence of Stalingrad became existential for Soviet soldiers in ways German troops couldn't match. October 14th, 1942. Paulus ordered the largest single assault of the battle. 90,000 German troops, supported by 2,000 Luftwaffe sorties and concentrated artillery fires from 300 guns, attacked along a 3-mile front toward the industrial district in northern Stalingrad. The objective was the tractor factory, the Barricade factory, and the Red October factory, the last major Soviet strongholds. German forces advanced with desperate determination, knowing this was likely their final chance to capture the city before winter. By day's end, they had penetrated Soviet defences in multiple locations, reached the tractor factory, and came within 500 metres of the Volga. Some German officers believed the battle was won. Paulus, cautiously optimistic, reported to Army Group that organised Soviet resistance would collapse within 48 hours. He was catastrophically wrong. Soviet forces didn't collapse. They absorbed the attack, fell back in some areas while holding firm in others, and counterattacked wherever Germans paused. The fighting in the factory district was even more savage than earlier battles. Multi-story factory buildings became vertical battlefields where Germans controlled the ground floor while Soviets held upper floors. Soldiers threw grenades down stairwells and elevator shafts. Machine guns fired through ventilation ducts. Combatants tunneled through walls to flank enemy positions. The tractor factory changed hands partially, with Germans holding half the building while Soviets defended the other half, separated by barricades thrown up in hallways. Neither side could dislodge the other. The battle became static, a siege within a siege. Both armies locked in a death embrace they couldn't escape. By early November, the 6th Army held 90% of Stalingrad. German forces occupied the western bank of the Volga for most of the city's length. Soviet defenders clung to narrow strips of ground, in some places less than 300 metres wide, with their backs literally against the river. German commanders believed final victory was inevitable, just a matter of days or weeks. Paulus reviewed the situation maps and saw Soviet forces compressed into shrinking pockets. He committed his last reserves, ordering the final push to reach the Volga along the entire front. On November 9th, elements of the 305th Infantry Division reached the river in the southern sector. On November 11th, units of the 71st Infantry Division broke through to the water in the central district. The 6th Army controlled the city. Paulus prepared his victory dispatch to Hitler, announcing Stalingrad's capture. But even as he drafted the message, Soviet forces continued fighting from positions they refused to abandon. And 400 miles to the northwest, far beyond Paulus's attention or concern, Soviet armies were massing for an operation that would transform his victory into a death sentence. September 12th, 1942. The Kremlin, Moscow. Joseph Stalin sits at a conference table in his office, studying maps of the southern front with Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky. The maps show German advances, the 6th Army approaching Stalingrad, Army Group A driving toward the Caucasus oil fields. On the surface, the situation appears catastrophic. German forces have penetrated hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, and the Wehrmacht seems poised to deliver a knockout blow. But Zhukov sees something different in the maps. He sees opportunity. The German advances have created enormous salients with dangerously exposed flanks. The 6th Army, fixated on Stalingrad, has stretched itself thin, with its northern flank held by the Romanian 3rd Army and its southern flank covered by the Romanian 4th Army. These Allied formations are equipped with obsolete weapons, lack mobile reserves, and their defensive positions are weaker than corresponding German sectors. Zhukov leans forward and traces his finger across the map, drawing 2 arrows that converge behind Stalingrad. Stalin watches silently. Then he asks the question that will change the war. Can we do something more serious there? The idea that would become Operation Uranus emerged from this meeting. Rather than continue feeding reinforcements into Stalingrad's meat grinder, Soviet command would launch a massive counter-offensive aimed not at the city but at the weak flanks protecting the 6th Army. 2 powerful armoured spearheads would strike simultaneously, one from Soviet positions northwest of Stalingrad, smashing through the Romanian 3rd Army, and another from the south, breaking through the Romanian 4th Army. The pincers would meet at Kalach on Don, roughly 50 miles behind the German front lines, encircling the 6th Army in Stalingrad. It was classic operational art, a double envelopment on a scale that would dwarf any encirclement battle of the war so far, but it required meticulous preparation, absolute secrecy, and perfect timing. Zhukov and Vasilevsky estimated they would need 2 months to assemble the forces and supplies for such an operation. Stalin, surprisingly, approved the plan immediately and authorized whatever resources were necessary. The planning and preparation for Uranus showcased Soviet operational capabilities that German intelligence consistently underestimated. Throughout October and early November, 3 Soviet fronts, the Southwest Front under General Nikolai Vatutin, the Don Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky, and the Stalingrad Front under General Andrei Yeremenko, quietly built up overwhelming force. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were moved into jump-off positions using night movements and strict radio silence to avoid German detection. 13,500 artillery pieces and mortars were concentrated in sectors northwest and south of Stalingrad, carefully camouflaged and hidden in forests and ravines. 1,463 tanks, including the new 34 medium tanks and KV-1 heavy tanks, assembled in staging areas beyond German observation. 1,350 aircraft were brought forward to support the offensive. The logistics of this build-up was staggering. Soviet railways, still recovering from 1941's devastation, ran thousands of trains carrying ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment to forward supply dumps. Engineers constructed dummy positions to deceive German reconnaissance while hiding real preparations. Entire divisions moved hundreds of miles by forced marches to reach assembly areas on time. Security was fanatical. Officers who discussed the operation were arrested and shot. Radio communications were forbidden, and soldiers were told only hours before the attack what their mission would be. Soviet deception operations created false radio traffic in sectors far from the real attack zones, suggesting offensives elsewhere. The result was a concentration of force unprecedented on the Eastern Front, and the Germans barely noticed. German intelligence failed catastrophically to understand what was developing. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights detected increased Soviet activity northwest and south of Stalingrad, but photo interpreters underestimated the force levels by at least 50%. German intelligence assessed Soviet forces at perhaps 400,000 men, less than half the actual number. Reports of tank concentrations were dismissed as exaggerations by frontline units prone to overestimating enemy strength. Most critically, German command assumed that Soviet forces, after suffering enormous casualties throughout 1942, lacked the strength for major offensive operations. The possibility that the Red Army could mass over 1 million men for a single operation seemed absurd. Wehrmacht intelligence was still fighting the war of 1941, expecting Soviet strategy to be reactive and desperate, not carefully planned and executed with operational sophistication. General Paulus received warnings about Soviet build-ups on his flanks throughout October and early November. His intelligence staff, analysing frontline reports and interrogations of captured Soviet soldiers, concluded that Soviet forces were preparing offensive operations. On November 9th, just days before Uranus launched, Paulus forwarded a detailed intelligence assessment to Army Group B headquarters, warning that Soviet concentrations northwest of Stalingrad appeared to be offensive in nature and posed a serious threat to the Romanian Third Army. He recommended either reinforcing the Romanian sector with German divisions or shortening the Sixth Army's front line by withdrawing from Stalingrad to create mobile reserves. The request went to Hitler through Field Marshal Maximilian von Weisch, commanding Army Group B, and then through the chain of command to the Führer's headquarters. Hitler's response was predictable and catastrophic. He rejected any withdrawal from Stalingrad, insisting that not 1 metre of captured ground could be abandoned. The city's symbolic value, bearing Stalin's name, made it politically essential to hold. Moreover, Hitler argued, Soviet offensive capabilities were exaggerated. If the Soviets did attack, German and Romanian forces would stop them at the defensive lines, and any breakthrough could be sealed by German mobile reserves. The problem with this analysis was that those mobile reserves didn't exist. The 48th Panzer Corps, positioned behind the Romanian Third Army as a reaction force, consisted of 3 panzer divisions, with a total of approximately 100 operational tanks between them. They were expected to stop multiple Soviet tank armies numbering over 800 tanks. The mathematics were impossible, but Hitler's strategic thinking was driven by will, not arithmetic. The Romanian forces holding the Sixth Army's flanks were aware of their vulnerability and deeply fearful of the coming storm. Romanian Third Army, commanded by General Petre Dumitrescu, held a 100-mile front northwest of Stalingrad, with approximately 140,000 men in 10 divisions. These units were largely infantry equipped, with rifles and machine guns dating to World War I. Their anti-tank defences consisted of obsolete Czech 37mm guns that could barely penetrate 34 armour. They had no tanks of their own, except for a few obsolete R2 light tanks armed only with machine guns. Romanian officers requested German anti-tank guns, more artillery, and armoured support. They received promises but little actual help. The Germans considered the Romanian sector a quiet area where Allied forces could hold ground, while German divisions focused on the critical sector in Stalingrad itself. Throughout early November, Romanian sentries reported strange observations: the sound of tank engines in the distance at night, the rumble of heavy vehicles moving off-road, occasional glimpses of Soviet trucks or armour before they disappeared into tree lines. Romanian intelligence officers compiled these reports and concluded that Soviet forces were massing for attack. On November 10th, a Romanian patrol captured 2 Soviet soldiers from a tank unit. Under interrogation, they revealed they were part of the 5th Tank Army, a formation not previously identified in the sector. This was critical intelligence. Tank armies were strategic-level formations used for major offensive operations, not defensive positions. Romanian command forwarded this information to German liaison officers, who forwarded it to 6th Army headquarters, where it was filed alongside dozens of other reports suggesting imminent Soviet attack. Paulus read these reports with growing concern but also a sense of helplessness. His army was committed to Stalingrad, locked in close combat that required every available man. He had no reserves to spare for the flanks. He couldn't withdraw from the city without Hitler's permission, which would never come. His only option was to continue the assault on Stalingrad, hoping to complete the capture before Soviet forces attacked elsewhere. On November 11th, German forces launched what they believed would be the final assault on Soviet positions in Stalingrad. Small units reached the Volga River in several locations. Some soldiers even washed their hands in the river, a symbolic gesture of reaching the final objective. Paulus allowed himself to believe that the battle was won. If Stalingrad fell in the next day or two, reserves could be pulled out of the city to strengthen the flanks. Timing was critical, and the 6th Army was in a race against time it didn't know it was losing. November 17th, 1942. Soviet forces in their assembly areas received final orders. Officers briefed their units on the mission. Soldiers checked weapons and equipment one last time. Artillery batteries loaded their guns. Tank crews performed final maintenance checks. The waiting was almost over. Marshal Zhukov at Southwest Front headquarters reviewed the attack plan one final time with General Vatutin. Everything was ready. At Don Front headquarters, Marshal Rokossovsky coordinated with his artillery commander, ensuring the preliminary bombardment would be synchronized across the entire front. At Stalingrad Front headquarters, General Yeremenko confirmed that his southern pincer was prepared to launch on schedule. All 3 commanders understood the stakes. If Uranus succeeded, it would encircle the largest German field army and potentially change the course of the entire war. If it failed, they would be relieved of command at best, shot at worst. There was no margin for error. As darkness fell on November 18th, Soviet soldiers huddled in trenches and assembly areas, waiting for dawn. Many wrote final letters home, knowing that Soviet offensive operations typically produced massive casualties in the first days. Political officers moved among the troops, delivering speeches about the historic importance of the coming battle, about defending the motherland, about revenge for German atrocities. Some soldiers were terrified, others were eager, viewing the offensive as a chance to strike back after months of defensive fighting. Officers checked their watches repeatedly, counting down the hours and minutes. At 6th Army headquarters in Golubinsky, 75 miles west of Stalingrad, Paulus reviewed routine situation reports and prepared for bed, unaware that 12 miles to the northwest, hidden in forests and ravines, 3,500 Soviet guns were being wheeled into firing position. In less than 12 hours, the trap would spring shut, and the general who never questioned orders would become the prey in the greatest encirclement of the war. November 19th, 1942, 7:30 in the morning. Fog shrouds the steppe northwest of Stalingrad, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters. Romanian soldiers in forward positions huddle against the cold, grateful that the fog will prevent German officers from conducting inspections. Then the fog lights up. 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and mortars fire simultaneously, shells screaming overhead, impacting Romanian defensive positions with apocalyptic fury. The bombardment lasts 80 minutes. It is not aimed at destroying every position, that would be impossible, but at shattering morale, cutting communications, and stunning defenders into paralysis. Romanian soldiers crouch in dugouts that collapse under direct hits, or are buried alive when nearby explosions cave in walls. Command posts lose contact with frontline units as telephone lines are shredded. Artillery batteries attempting to return fire are targeted by Soviet counter-battery fire directed by spotter aircraft that rose above the fog at dawn. When the barrage finally lifts at 8:50 a.m., Romanian soldiers emerge from shelters to find their defensive line a moonscape of overlapping craters, destroyed weapons, and bodies. At 9 a.m., Soviet infantry and armour attacked. The 5th Tank Army, under General Pavel Romanenko, sent 250 tanks forward in the first wave, supported by infantry from the 21st and 65th Armies. Romanian positions, already shattered by bombardment, offered minimal resistance. Romanian anti-tank guns, obsolete 37mm weapons, fired at approaching 34 tanks and watched their shells bounce off frontal armour. Machine gun fire rattled harmlessly against tank hulls. Within an hour, Soviet armour had penetrated the first defensive line. By noon, the breach was 30 kilometres wide and advancing deeper by the minute. Romanian units attempted to retreat in order, but quickly dissolved into fleeing mobs of soldiers, abandoning weapons and equipment, desperately trying to escape the Soviet onslaught. German liaison officers with Romanian units sent frantic radio messages back to 6th Army headquarters. The front was collapsing, Soviet armour was breaking through in massive strength. The situation was catastrophic. General Paulus received the first reports at his headquarters in Golubinsky shortly after 9 a.m. Initially, he assumed this was a local Soviet attack, similar to previous probes against weak sectors. He ordered the 48th Panzer Corps, positioned as a mobile reserve behind the Romanian 3rd Army, to counterattack immediately and seal any breaches. But, as more reports arrived, the true scale of the disaster became clear. This wasn't a local attack. It was a full-scale offensive with multiple tank corps smashing through Romanian lines along a 100-kilometre front. The 48th Panzer Corps, with approximately 100 operational tanks, was being asked to stop over 250 Soviet tanks in the initial assault wave, with hundreds more in reserve. German panzer crews fought desperately, achieving local successes, knocking out Soviet tanks at favourable exchange rates, but they were outnumbered 5-1 and fighting across terrain that favoured the attacker. November 20th, 1942. The second pincer launched. South of Stalingrad, Soviet artillery of the Stalingrad front opened fire on positions held by the Romanian 4th Army. The pattern was identical to the northern assault. Massive bombardment followed by armour-led attacks that shattered Romanian defensive lines. The 57th, 51st and 64th Soviet armies attacked with fresh tank formations, including the 4th Tank Corps and 4th Mechanized Corps. Romanian forces, weakened by months of combat and inadequately equipped, collapsed even faster than their comrades to the north. By afternoon, Soviet armour was racing westward and northward, aiming to link up with the northern pincer at Kalach on Don, the town where the 6th Army's main supply bridge crossed the Don River. If the pincers met, the entire 6th Army would be encircled. Paulus, watching the situation develop from his headquarters, recognised the operational geometry with the clarity of the trained staff officer he was. 2 Soviet offensives, perfectly coordinated, aimed at meeting in the 6th Army's rear area. Classic double envelopment. Textbook encirclement. The kind of operation he had planned himself during staff exercises and executed successfully at Kharkov. Except now, the 6th Army was the target, not the executor. He immediately grasped that his army faced potential disaster unless drastic action was taken within hours. The obvious response was to break off combat in Stalingrad, concentrate forces, and either defeat one of the Soviet pincers before they met, or fight through the encirclement before it solidified. This was what doctrine demanded, what his training taught, what any competent army commander would do. But Friedrich Paulus was not any commander. He was a man constitutionally incapable of taking independent action without explicit permission from higher command. November 20th evening, Paulus sent urgent messages to Field Marshal von Weich at Army Group B headquarters and directly to Hitler's headquarters. The messages described the situation, emphasized the danger, and requested permission for the Sixth Army to break off operations in Stalingrad and withdraw westward. Paulus proposed concentrating his forces, fighting through one of the Soviet pincers, and re-establishing the front on a shorter, more defensible line. He did not order this movement on his own authority. He asked for permission. While he waited for responses, his staff prepared contingency plans for both withdrawal and continued defence. Officers sketched routes of march, calculated fuel requirements, and estimated how long it would take various units to disengage from Stalingrad and march west. The numbers were not encouraging. The Sixth Army was spread across hundreds of square kilometres. Units locked in close combat in Stalingrad couldn't simply disengage. Soviet forces would slaughter them during withdrawal. The army would need at least 48 hours to organise a coordinated movement, and that was time they didn't have. November 21st, 1942. Soviet tank columns raced across the frozen steppe, covering 50 to 70 kilometres per day, far faster than German intelligence believed possible. Romanian forces had effectively ceased to exist as organised formations. Some units surrendered en masse, others scattered into small groups trying to reach German lines. Most simply dissolved as soldiers fled individually. German units attempting to block Soviet advances were overrun or bypassed. The Soviet 26th Tank Corps reached the outskirts of Kalach on November 22nd, having advanced 90 kilometres in 3 days. Elements of the Soviet 4th Tank Corps, approaching from the south, made contact with advance units from the northern pincer. German officers watching from observation posts witnessed Soviet tanks linking up in the distance. The encirclement was complete. November 23rd, 1942. 4 p.m. Soviet forces from the northern and southern pincers met officially at Kalach on Don. The trap had closed. Approximately 265,000 men were now encircled in a pocket roughly 50 kilometres east to west and 40 kilometres north to south. The pocket contained 20 German divisions, 2 Romanian divisions, and various support units, the entire 6th Army plus significant elements of the 4th Panzer Army. German soldiers in Stalingrad, focused on their brutal street fighting, barely noticed the disaster unfolding in their rear. They heard rumours of Soviet attacks on the flanks, but assumed, as they had been trained to assume, that German command would handle strategic problems. Many believed the encirclement would be temporary, broken within days by relief operations. They were tragically wrong. Paulus, at his headquarters, called an emergency conference with his corps commanders. The meeting was tense. Every commander present understood the gravity of the situation. General Hans Valentin Hube, commanding the 14th Panzer Corps, argued for immediate breakout before Soviet forces solidified the encirclement ring. General Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commanding the 51st Corps, was even more emphatic. The army must abandon Stalingrad immediately, concentrate all forces, and smash through the weakest point in the Soviet encirclement. Casualties would be heavy, perhaps 50,000 men, but half the army could be saved. Time was critical. Every hour of delay allowed Soviets to reinforce the encirclement and made breakout more difficult. Both generals looked to Paulus, waiting for him to give the order to break out. The army commander sat silently, his hands trembling with the nervous shake that had plagued him for months. Finally, he spoke. They would wait for instructions from the Führer. November 24th, 1942. Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, in East Prussia. A conference room filled with senior officers receiving reports from the southern front. The encirclement of the 6th Army dominated all discussion. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, presented options: authorize immediate breakout, send relief forces to rescue the 6th Army, or order the army to hold position and establish an air bridge to supply the pocket. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, interrupted the discussion with a bombastic promise. The Luftwaffe could supply the pocket entirely by air, delivering 550 tons of supplies daily. Luftwaffe officers present, knowing the actual capabilities of the transport fleet, were stunned. General Hans Jeschneck, the Luftwaffe Chief of Staff, tried to object, pointing out that 550 tons daily was impossible given available aircraft, distances, weather, and Soviet air defences. Goering silenced him, insisting that where the Reichsmarshal promised something, it would be delivered. Hitler seized on Goering's promise. The Sixth Army would form a hedgehog defence at Stalingrad, supplied entirely by air, and wait for relief forces to break through the encirclement. The decision was military madness but psychological necessity for Hitler. Abandoning Stalingrad meant admitting defeat, surrendering the city that bore Stalin's name, accepting the first major German strategic reverse since the invasion began. Hitler's entire strategic vision was built on projecting invincibility. Retreat would shatter that image. Moreover, he convinced himself that the Sixth Army's position wasn't hopeless. The pocket was large, containing a major city with some infrastructure. The army could defend from fortified positions. And the Luftwaffe, which Goering promised could work miracles, would keep the army supplied until relief arrived. At 10 p.m. on November 24th, Hitler's order reached Sixth Army headquarters. The army will form hedgehog defence and await relief. The Luftwaffe will ensure supply. Fortress Stalingrad is to be held at all costs. Paulus read the order without visible emotion. His chief of staff, Arthur Schmidt, immediately began implementing the directive, issuing orders to units to organise defensive positions, establish supply points for air-delivered materials, and prepare for sustained defensive operations. When some staff officers questioned the feasibility of an airlift, Schmidt silenced them, declaring that the Führer's orders were to be executed, not debated. Paulus signed the message acknowledging Hitler's directive and confirming that the Sixth Army would comply. He did not protest. He did not argue for breakout. He did not exercise independent judgment. The perfect staff officer, confronted with an order that sentenced his army to death, simply obeyed. In that moment, the fate of 265,000 men was sealed. The jaws had closed, and the man with the power to order them open chose instead to wait for someone else to make the decision. Friedrich Paulus, who never questioned orders, would now discover what obedience cost when the orders were insane. November 24th, 1942. Evening, 6th Army headquarters in the village of Gumrak, 12 miles west of Stalingrad. The staff officers, who comprise the nerve centre of Germany's largest field army, move through their duties with mechanical efficiency, but the atmosphere is thick with unspoken dread. Hitler's order has arrived. Stand fast. Wait for relief. Accept Luftwaffe supply via airlift. General Friedrich Paulus sits in his private office, the written directive on the desk before him. He has read it perhaps a dozen times, as if repetition might change its content. His hands shake with the tremor that has become constant. Outside this room, his corps commanders are waiting for him to do what every military academy teaches, what every war game demonstrates, what common sense demands: overrule an impossible order and save his army. Instead, Paulus reaches for a message form and begins drafting his acknowledgement. The Sixth Army will hold its position and await relief. He writes, "Request confirmation of supply quantities and relief timeline." The words are passive, deferential, seeking reassurance rather than asserting command authority. The document that will doom his army. The decision to hold at Stalingrad rather than attempt immediate breakout was not made in a single moment, but across several critical days where alternatives narrowed and options vanished. November 23rd had been the moment of maximum possibility. The Soviet encirclement was barely 12 hours old, the ring was thin and weak in places, and a concentrated Sixth Army breakout would likely have punched through with acceptable casualties. But that required Paulus to act immediately, without waiting for Hitler's permission, and such independence was alien to his nature. November 24th brought Hitler's explicit order to stand fast, which gave Paulus what he seemed to need: clear direction from higher authority. November 25th saw General Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commanding the 51st Corps, take independent action born of desperation. Without authorization from Paulus, Seydlitz began withdrawing his units from northern Stalingrad, moving them westward in the first stages of what he hoped would force a general breakout. The unauthorized withdrawal was both militarily sound and insubordinate, a gamble that Paulus would be compelled to support the movement once it began. Paulus's response to Seydlitz's unauthorized action revealed everything about his command philosophy. Rather than supporting the movement or even tacitly allowing it to continue, Paulus ordered Seydlitz to halt immediately and return his units to their original positions. The order was delivered with unmistakable severity. Any further unauthorized movements would be treated as disobedience warranting court-martial. Seydlitz, a veteran officer who had fought brilliantly throughout the war, complied bitterly, knowing that the opportunity for breakout was slipping away with each passing hour. In a private conversation with fellow corps commanders, Seydlitz reportedly said that Paulus was a man who could plan a brilliant operation but lacked the courage to execute one without permission. The assessment was cruel but accurate. The Sixth Army had a commander who would rather follow suicidal orders than make independent decisions that might save lives but risk displeasure from Hitler. The role of Major General Arthur Schmidt, Paulus's chief of staff, in the fatal decision cannot be understated. Schmidt was a committed National Socialist, unusual among Wehrmacht general officers who were largely apolitical professionals. He believed fervently in Hitler's strategic genius and viewed any suggestion of withdrawal or surrender as defeatism bordering on treason. Schmidt reinforced Paulus's worst instincts, framing obedience to Hitler as not just a military necessity but a moral imperative. In staff discussions about the encirclement, Schmidt repeatedly invoked the Führer's orders, reminding officers that German soldiers did not question commands from above. When officers raised concerns about the airlift's feasibility, Schmidt dismissed them as lacking faith in German capabilities. The dynamic between Paulus and Schmidt was psychologically toxic, a weak commander seeking guidance, and a fanatical subordinate providing certainty without wisdom. The promise of Luftwaffe resupply was central to the decision to stand fast, and Hermann Göring's role in this disaster was criminally negligent. On November 24th, when Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could deliver 550 tons of supplies daily to the encircled Sixth Army, he was either lying or delusional. Luftwaffe staff officers immediately recognized the impossibility. Supplying the pocket required approximately 550 tons daily, 350 tons of food for 265,000 men, 100 tons of ammunition, 50 tons of fuel, and 50 tons of medical supplies and miscellaneous items. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet consisted of approximately 500 Junkers 52 transport planes, each capable of carrying 2.5 tons. That meant 220 sorties daily, every single day, regardless of weather, mechanical failures, or combat losses. The distance from the nearest German-controlled airfields to the pocket was 200 kilometers one way, meaning each plane could fly perhaps one sortie per day if conditions were perfect. But conditions would never be perfect. Winter weather over southern Russia was notoriously unpredictable. Blizzards, ice storms, fog that reduced visibility to zero, and temperatures that froze fuel lines and hydraulic systems. Soviet fighters are increasingly active as the Red Air Force recovered from 1941's losses would target the slow, lumbering transport planes. Soviet anti-aircraft guns ringed the pocket, turning approach corridors into killing zones. Worst of all, the airlift infrastructure simply didn't exist. Airfields near the pocket were primitive, lacking hardened runways, maintenance facilities, or fuel storage adequate for intensive operations. Aircraft that broke down often sat for days waiting for spare parts. Luftwaffe officers who dared voice these concerns to Göring were accused of defeatism and dismissed from planning discussions. The Reichsmarshal's promise was born of desperation to restore his prestige after recent Luftwaffe failures and a pathological inability to admit limitation. It would cost tens of thousands of lives. Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army began organising for sustained defence. Paulus issued detailed orders for establishing defensive perimeters, conserving ammunition, and preparing airfields to receive supply aircraft. 2 airfields were available. Pitomnik, the largest, capable of handling multiple aircraft simultaneously, and Gumrak, smaller but serviceable. A 3rd emergency landing strip was prepared near Stalingrad's ruins. German engineers worked desperately to improve these facilities, laying metal matting to reinforce runways, digging revetments to protect parked aircraft, and establishing fuel depots. Meanwhile, the army began calculating daily consumption rates. Infantry divisions needed approximately 3 tons of supplies daily to maintain defensive operations. Artillery batteries required 5 to 10 tons depending on fire missions. The 6th Army's horses, 10,000 of them used for transport and artillery traction, needed 250 tons of fodder daily. When staff officers added all requirements, the total exceeded 600 tons per day, not 550. But questioning the airlift's adequacy was forbidden. The first supply flights arrived on November 25th. Junkers 52 transports landed at Potomnik, carrying ammunition, food, and fuel. Soldiers unloaded the aircraft eagerly, grateful for the supplies but quietly noting the quantities were far less than needed. Instead of 550 tons, the first day's airlift delivered approximately 60 tons. Luftwaffe officers explained this was an initial effort, that operations would ramp up quickly. But over the next week, daily delivery averaged 94 tons, less than 20% of requirements. Paulus reviewed the logistics reports with growing alarm. At current delivery rates, the army would exhaust its stockpiled food within 3 weeks and ammunition within 1 month. He forwarded these calculations to Army Group headquarters with increasingly urgent requests for confirmation that the airlift would meet promised levels. The responses were reassuring in words, but empty of substance. The Luftwaffe was working to improve operations. Weather was temporarily affecting flights. Deliveries would increase soon. December brought the brutal reality of Russian winter. Temperatures dropped to -20 Celsius, then -30. Soldiers in the pocket, still wearing the standard uniforms designed for Western European conditions, suffered terribly from the cold. Frostbite casualties began exceeding combat casualties. Men wrapped themselves in blankets, rags, newspapers, anything to provide insulation. Boots froze solid overnight, requiring hours by fires to thaw before soldiers could put them on. Equipment failed, rifle bolts froze, vehicle engines seized, artillery recoil mechanisms cracked. The daily ration was reduced to 200 grams of bread and 120 grams of meat per man, roughly 1/3 of the normal allocation. Soldiers began slaughtering the transport horses for food, eating horse meat that was stringy and nearly tasteless but at least provided protein. The horses' deaths created another crisis. Without them, artillery couldn't be moved, supplies couldn't be transported from airfields to frontline units, and the army's already limited mobility vanished entirely. The men defending the pocket understood they had been abandoned long before their commanders admitted it. Soldiers wrote letters home that were never sent, confiscated by military censors who didn't want defeatist messages reaching Germany. In these letters, men described their hunger, their cold, their growing certainty that they would not survive. Some cursed Hitler, blaming the Führer for their situation. Others blamed Paulus, calling him weak and indecisive. Many simply expressed resignation, accepting that they would die in Russia without understanding why. Soviet propaganda loudspeakers began broadcasting into German lines, offering promises of food, warmth, and survival if soldiers surrendered. Most Germans ignored these appeals, but some, especially among non-German auxiliaries and Eastern European volunteers, began crossing lines individually or in small groups. Paulus ordered that any deserters who were caught be shot, and military police executed dozens. But the executions couldn't stop the erosion of morale or the growing realization that the pocket was a tomb. Paulus himself was deteriorating physically and psychologically. The hand tremor that had always appeared under stress became constant and uncontrollable. His left eye developed a tic that gave him a ghastly appearance. He lost weight rapidly, refusing to eat more than his soldiers received, a gesture of solidarity that earned respect from those who knew but did nothing to improve the situation. Sleep eluded him. Staff officers reported seeing lights in his office at 3 or 4 in the morning as he reviewed reports and drafted messages to higher command. Those messages became increasingly desperate, requesting relief operations, increased airlift capacity, permission to reduce the pocket size by abandoning Stalingrad itself to shorten defensive lines. Every request was denied. Hitler insisted the entire pocket must be held, that every position was essential, that relief was coming soon. Paulus accepted these assurances publicly, while privately losing faith that rescue would arrive in time. By mid-December, the Sixth Army had been encircled for 3 weeks, and the promised airlift was delivering approximately 100 tons daily, less than 1/5 of requirements. The army was slowly starving, slowly freezing, and slowly dying. German forces still held firm against Soviet probing attacks, but defensive capabilities were eroding. Ammunition for artillery was being rationed strictly, fuel for vehicles was nearly exhausted, medical supplies were running dangerously low. Yet Paulus continued to obey orders, to maintain the hedgehog defence, to wait for relief that seemed increasingly unlikely. The fatal order of November 24th had set the Sixth Army on a path to destruction, and the man who could have changed that path with a single decision, a single act of disobedience, chose instead the path of obedience unto death. Friedrich Paulus, the perfect staff officer, was discovering that perfection in following orders was indistinguishable from suicide when the orders were insane. December 12, 1942, 5:45 in the morning. 150 miles southwest of Stalingrad, German artillery opens fire along a narrow front, shells screaming towards Soviet defensive positions. This is the beginning of Operation Winter Storm, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's desperate attempt to rescue the encircled Sixth Army. The relief force is pitifully small for the enormous task. 3 divisions, approximately 30,000 men and 230 tanks, attacking toward a pocket containing over 250,000 trapped soldiers. Von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant operational commanders, has been given an impossible mission with inadequate resources. But he is attempting it anyway because the alternative is abandoning the Sixth Army to certain destruction. At the spearhead of the relief force is General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, the same formation that raced to the Volga in August. Now those panzers are racing back, not in triumph, but in desperation, trying to reach their comrades before time runs out. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, 75 miles to the northeast, General Friedrich Paulus receives word that relief is coming. For the first time in weeks, there is hope. It will prove to be the cruelest hope of all. Field Marshal von Manstein had arrived on the southern front on November 27th, 5 days after the Sixth Army was encircled, to take command of the newly formed Army Group Don. His mission was stated simply, restore the situation. In practical terms, this meant either relieving the Sixth Army or organising its breakout, or both. Von Manstein immediately assessed the situation with his characteristic clarity. The Sixth Army could not be supplied adequately by air. Goering's promises were fantasy. The pocket would exhaust its supplies within weeks, perhaps days if Soviet attacks intensified. Therefore, relief must come quickly, and it must enable the Sixth Army to break out. Von Manstein began scraping together every available unit for the relief operation. The 6th and 17th Panzer Divisions were pulled from other sectors. The 23rd Panzer Division was transferred from France. These formations were under strength, tired from previous combat, and lacking adequate supplies, but they were all von Manstein had. The operational concept for Winter Storm was straightforward. Attack northeast from positions near Kotelnikovo toward the Sixth Army pocket, advancing roughly 100 miles through Soviet-held territory. If successful, the relief force would reach the pocket's southwestern edge, establish a corridor, and enable the Sixth Army to withdraw. Von Manstein codenamed the subsequent breakout operation Thunderclap. He envisioned the Sixth Army attacking southwest to meet the relief force, the two forces linking up, and the combined formation withdrawing to a more defensible line. But Thunderclap required Paulus to take independent action, to begin moving his army toward the relief force without waiting for explicit permission from Hitler. This was the critical problem. Von Manstein was planning an operation that depended on Paulus making a decision the general had proven incapable of making. The relief attack began with initial success that seemed to validate von Manstein's operational skill. 4th Panzer Army smashed through initial Soviet defensive positions, advanced 20 miles on the first day, and created panic in Soviet command. Stalin, terrified that the relief might succeed, ordered immediate reinforcement of the sector. The 2nd Guards Army, a powerful formation held in reserve, was rushed south to block the German advance. Additional tank brigades, and rifle divisions were transferred from other fronts. But Soviet reinforcements took time to arrive, and for several days the German advance continued. December 15th, 20 miles gained. December 16th, another 15 miles. December 17th, the relief force crossed the Axe River and reached the Mishkova River, 48 kilometers from the Stalingrad pocket. German tankers could see the distant glow of fires from the pocket at night. They were agonizingly close. Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army monitored the relief force's progress with desperate hope. Paulus received regular updates from Army Group Don headquarters reporting winter storms advances. His staff calculated distances, estimated how long it would take the relief force to reach the pocket, and prepared contingency plans. But they also calculated something more troubling: fuel requirements for the Sixth Army to attack southwest and link up with Hoth's forces. The army needed approximately 4,000 tons of fuel to conduct mobile operations. Current stockpiles, approximately 200 tons. Even if every drop of fuel was concentrated in mobile units, the Sixth Army could barely move 20 kilometers before running dry. Paulus forwarded these calculations to von Manstein, accompanied by a request for explicit orders. Should the Sixth Army break out, and if so, how would it be supplied with fuel? December 19th, 1942. This was the day that would haunt historians forever, the moment when the Sixth Army could have been saved but wasn't. General Hoth's relief force reached Verkhney Kumsky on the Mishkova River, 48 kilometers from the pocket's southwestern perimeter. This was the closest relief forces would ever get. Von Manstein, recognizing this was the critical moment, sent the signal thunderclap to Sixth Army headquarters. Prepare for breakout operations to link with 4th Panzer Army. The order was not yet explicit authorization to abandon Stalingrad entirely, but it was clear guidance to begin moving. Von Manstein knew that if Paulus waited for Hitler's formal permission, which would never come, the opportunity would vanish. He needed Paulus to act independently, to interpret thunderclap as sufficient authority to begin withdrawing from the pocket. Paulus received the thunderclap signal at his headquarters in Gumrak. He immediately convened a conference with his corps commanders and chief of staff. The debate that followed was heated and tragic. General Hans Valentin Hube, commanding the 14th Panzer Corps, argued passionately for immediate breakout. The relief force was less than 50 kilometers away. The Sixth Army could concentrate its mobile units, abandon its heavy equipment, and fight through to Hoth's positions within 48 hours. Casualties would be heavy, but most of the army could be saved. General Karl Strecker, commanding the 11th Corps, agreed, adding that the army's condition was deteriorating daily and would only worsen if they remained in the pocket. Even some staff officers, normally deferential to their commander, spoke in favor of immediate action. They all looked to Paulus, waiting for the order that would save the army. Paulus's response was characteristic and catastrophic. He acknowledged that thunderclap authorized preparation for breakout, but argued that it did not explicitly order abandonment of Stalingrad. Moreover, the fuel situation made a breakout problematic. Without 4,000 tons of fuel, mobile units couldn't reach the relief force. Infantry divisions would have to march on foot, abandoning their artillery and heavy equipment, and would be vulnerable to Soviet attacks during withdrawal. Paulus calculated that a breakout attempt without adequate preparation and resources would result in chaos, enormous casualties, and possibly complete destruction of the army. Better to wait for clearer orders from Hitler to request explicit permission to abandon Stalingrad, and to demand that the Luftwaffe deliver sufficient fuel before attempting breakout. This reasoning was technically logical, but strategically suicidal. Every hour of delay allowed Soviet forces to reinforce the blocking positions and made breakout more difficult. Major General Schmidt, Paulus's chief of staff, reinforced the commander's hesitation with ideological fervor. Schmidt argued that abandoning Stalingrad without the Führer's explicit permission would be treasonous. The army had been ordered to hold Fortress Stalingrad, and German soldiers did not disobey orders. Moreover, Schmidt insisted the relief force would surely advance farther, perhaps reaching the pocket's perimeter entirely, making a breakout unnecessary. This optimistic assessment ignored the obvious. Hoth's forces were stalled at the Mishkova River by increasingly powerful Soviet resistance. The relief force was taking heavy casualties, and time was running out. But Schmidt's fanatical Loyalty to Hitler prevailed in the command discussion, giving Paulus the justification he needed to avoid making a decision. December 19th, evening. Paulus composed a message to von Manstein and Hitler's headquarters. The message explained the fuel shortage, requested explicit authorization to abandon Stalingrad, and asked for confirmation that adequate fuel supplies could be airlifted before breakout began. The message was a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion, requesting permission for something that needed to be done immediately while creating conditions that made action impossible. Von Manstein, reading the message at Army Group headquarters, was appalled. He understood what Paulus did. Not there would be no fuel airlift sufficient for breakout. Hitler would never give explicit permission to abandon Stalingrad, and the relief force couldn't hold its position indefinitely. Manstein sent an urgent reply, "It is now or never." The message was as close to a direct order to disobey Hitler as Manstein could send without technically committing insubordination himself. Paulus read the message and took no action. December 21st, 1942. The opportunity vanished. Soviet forces launched powerful counterattacks against Hoth's relief force, bringing fresh armies into the battle. The 2nd Guards Army, now fully deployed, attacked 4th Panzer Army's flanks with overwhelming force. Simultaneously, Soviet forces launched Operation Little Saturn, a massive offensive against the Italian 8th Army northwest of the pocket. The Italian army, even more poorly equipped than Romanian forces, had been collapsed completely. Soviet armour poured through the gap, threatening to encircle Army Group Don itself. Von Manstein was forced to choose between continuing the relief attempt and saving his own army group from destruction. He chose survival. On December 23rd, he ordered Hoth to withdraw from the Mishkova River and redeploy westward to block Soviet advances. Operation Winter Storm was over. The relief force retreated, and the distance from the pocket grew from 48 kilometres to 60, then 80, then 100. Inside the pocket, soldiers who had been told relief was 48 kilometres away watched in despair as the relief force withdrew. Some units had begun unauthorised preparations for breakout, stockpiling ammunition and destroying non-essential equipment. Officers had briefed their men on the plan. When relief forces reached close enough, the 6th Army would attack simultaneously from the inside, while Hoth attacked from outside, and the two forces would link up. Now those plans meant nothing. The relief force was gone. The pocket was alone. Paulus informed his commanders that the army would continue holding its positions and await further orders. Some officers wept. Others raged at their commander's passivity. General von Seydlitz, who had attempted unauthorized withdrawal weeks earlier, reportedly told Paulus to his face that he had murdered the 6th Army through cowardice. Paulus said nothing in response, his trembling hands clasped before him, his face a mask of exhausted resignation. The failure of Winter Storm doomed the 6th Army, but it also revealed something profound about command and obedience. Von Manstein had given Paulus everything needed to save his army. A relief force fighting desperately to reach him, explicit warning that time was critical, and sufficient authorization to begin breakout operations. What von Manstein couldn't provide was the moral courage to act independently, to disobey an order when obedience meant death. Paulus lacked that courage fundamentally and completely. He was a man who could plan brilliant operations but couldn't execute them without permission, who could see the path to salvation but couldn't walk it without someone holding his hand. The 6th Army didn't die because Winter Storm failed. It died because, when the relief force came, within 48 kilometres of rescue, the man commanding the pocket chose to wait for orders that would never come rather than make the decision that would save his men. Friedrich Paulus, the perfect staff officer, had failed the ultimate test of field command, the moment when you must disobey to survive. November 25th, 1942. Dawn breaks over Pitomnik airfield, 12 miles west of Stalingrad, inside the encircled pocket. The field is a primitive affair. Dirt and grass runways partially reinforced with metal matting, a few wooden buildings serving as operation centres, and fuel trucks clustered near makeshift refuelling points. Ground crews, wearing every piece of clothing they own against the bitter cold, watch the eastern sky for the transport aircraft that Hermann Goering promised would keep the 6th Army alive. At 7:15 a.m, they hear the distant drone of engines. 3 Junkers, 52 transports appear through low clouds, banking toward the runway in a cautious approach. Soviet anti-aircraft guns immediately open fire, black puffs of flak appearing around the aircraft. One plane is hit, smoke streaming from its engine, but limps to the runway and lands hard. The other 2 touch down safely. Ground crews rush forward to unload. Crates of ammunition, sacks of flour, medical supplies, total cargo delivered, approximately 18 tons, divided among 3 aircraft. The 6th Army needs 550 tons daily. The airlift, on which the survival of 265,000 men depends, has begun. It will prove to be one of the most tragic failures in aviation history. The concept of supplying an encircled army by air was not unprecedented. The Luftwaffe had successfully supplied the Demyansk pocket northwest of Moscow during the winter of 1941 to 1942, delivering supplies to 100,000 encircled troops for 3 months until ground forces broke through. But Demyansk was fundamentally different from Stalingrad. The Demyansk pocket was smaller, requiring fewer supplies. The distance from German airfields to the pocket was shorter, allowing more sorties per aircraft per day. Most critically, Soviet air defences were weaker and weather was slightly more favourable. Goering, desperate to restore Luftwaffe prestige after setbacks during the Battle of Britain and recent failures on the Eastern Front, seized on the Demyansk precedent while ignoring all the factors that made Stalingrad infinitely more difficult. His promise of 550 tons daily was not based on careful logistics analysis but on wishful thinking and pathological optimism. The mathematics of the airlift were brutal and unforgiving. The 6th Army's daily requirements totaled approximately 600 tons, 350 tons of food for 265,000 men, 100 tons of ammunition for defensive operations, 50 tons of fuel for vehicles and heating, 50 tons of medical supplies and miscellaneous items, and 50 tons of fodder for the 10,000 horses still alive in the pocket. Luftwaffe transport capability consisted of approximately 500 Junkers, 52 aircraft. The backbone of the German transport fleet. Each Ju-52 could carry 2.5 tons maximum. To deliver 600 tons daily required 240 sorties, meaning nearly half the entire transport fleet would need to fly every single day. The nearest German-controlled airfields were at Morozovskaya and Tatsinskaya, roughly 200 kilometers from Pitomnik. Round-trip flight time was approximately 3.5 hours, meaning each aircraft could fly 1 sortie per day under ideal conditions. But conditions would never be ideal. Weather was the first enemy. Russian winter weather was notoriously unpredictable and savage. Temperatures regularly dropped to -30 Celsius, cold enough to freeze fuel lines and hydraulic systems. Blizzards reduced visibility to 0, making navigation impossible. Ice formed on wings and control surfaces, adding dangerous weight and disrupting airflow. Winds at altitude reached 100 km per hour, buffeting the slow-moving transports. Cloud cover extended from ground level to 5,000 meters, forcing pilots to fly on instruments through conditions that tested even the most experienced aviators. Luftwaffe meteorologists tracked weather patterns and designated flyable days versus non-flyable days. During the 72-day airlift operation, only 42 days had weather conditions that permitted significant operations. On the other 30 days, aircraft were grounded, or only a handful of flights could be attempted. Every grounded day meant the 6th Army received nothing while still consuming its stockpiles. Soviet air defences were the second enemy. The Red Air Force, written off by German intelligence in 1941 as essentially destroyed, had recovered dramatically. Soviet fighters, including Yak-9 and La-5 models that could match German fighters in performance, patrolled the approaches to the pocket. Soviet commanders established fighter patrols along known German flight routes, vectoring interceptors to attack the slow, vulnerable transports. Soviet anti-aircraft artillery ringed the pocket, creating zones of intense flak that transport pilots had to fly through during approach and departure. The Ju-52, flying at 200 km per hour maximum speed, was nearly defenseless against either fighters or flak. German fighter escorts helped but were limited by their own range and fuel constraints. Many transport missions flew without escorts, relying on bad weather to hide from Soviet fighters. It was an appalling gamble with aircrews' lives. The first weeks of the airlift established a pattern of inadequate delivery. November 25th through November 30th, approximately 30 tons delivered daily, less than 6% of requirements. December 1st through December 15th, average delivery increased to 94 tons daily, still less than 18% of requirements. Every day, 6th Army logistics officers calculated the growing deficit. Food stocks dropped from adequate levels to concerning levels to critical levels. By mid-December, the daily ration was reduced to 200 grams of bread per man, roughly 2 slices, plus 120 grams of meat, usually horse meat from animals slaughtered for food. Soldiers joked bitterly that the ration was enough to starve slowly rather than quickly. Officers sent increasingly desperate messages to Luftwaffe headquarters requesting increased deliveries. The responses were always the same. Operations were being intensified, weather was temporarily affecting operations, deliveries would increase soon. The Luftwaffe crews flying the airlift missions suffered terribly. Transport pilots were not elite fighter jockeys, they were cargo haulers, often older men or those lacking the reflexes for fighter combat. They flew lumbering aircraft that shook violently in turbulence, leaked cold air through dozens of gaps in the fuselage, and had heating systems that barely functioned. Ice formed on the inside of cockpit windows. Pilots navigated by dead reckoning, using compass headings and estimated wind drift because navigation aids didn't exist. Many flew the same route daily until Soviet fighters learned to ambush them. One pilot described a typical mission: take off at dawn from Morozovskaya in darkness, climb to 4,000 meters while flying on instruments through clouds, navigate 200 kilometers by compass, descend through clouds hoping to break out directly over Potomac, land while Soviet artillery fired at the field, unload cargo while ground crews rushed, load wounded for the return flight, take off through more artillery fire, climb back into clouds, fly 200 kilometers, back through weather, and Soviet fighters land with fuel gauge reading empty, all for 2.5 tons of supplies. Aircraft losses mounted steadily. Soviet fighters shot down transports approaching the pocket or returning to base. Anti-aircraft fire destroyed planes during landing, approach, or takeoff. Some aircraft simply disappeared, lost in weather, crashing into the steppe with no witnesses. Others made emergency landings in Soviet territory after battle damage or mechanical failure, crews captured or killed. A few crashed at German airfields due to pilot exhaustion or mechanical failure. Luftwaffe records documented the losses with grim precision. November, 42 aircraft destroyed. December, 85 aircraft destroyed. January, 147 aircraft destroyed. The transport fleet, finite and irreplaceable, was being consumed as surely as the 6th Army it was supposed to supply. By mid-January, Luftwaffe had lost over 270 aircraft. Over half its transport fleet committed to the Stalingrad airlift. Goering's promise of unlimited supply capability was revealed as a monstrous lie built on bureaucratic pride and criminal negligence. Inside the pocket, the airlift's failure manifested in visible ways. Soldiers weakened from hunger, moving slowly, conserving energy for essential tasks only. Wounded men lay in field hospitals without adequate medical supplies, surgeries performed without anesthesia, amputations conducted with saws meant for carpentry. Horses, essential for transporting supplies from airfields to frontline units, died from starvation and cold at a rate of 50 to 100 daily. Their frozen carcasses littered the pocket, butchered for meat that tasted foul but provided calories. The few vehicles still operational sat immobilized for lack of fuel. Artillery batteries rationed shells to 10 per gun per day, firing only at confirmed targets. Infantry units stretched ammunition, officers ordering soldiers to hold fire except at close range, where hits were certain. The entire army was winding down, slowly losing the capability to fight or even to survive. December 23rd, 1942. Special Christmas supply flight. Luftwaffe headquarters, in a gesture of seasonal morale building, organised a special airlift of Christmas supplies for the 6th Army. Transports loaded with chocolate, cigarettes, bread, and even a few bottles of schnapps flew through terrible weather to deliver holiday cheer. Total tonnage delivered in the Christmas airlift: approximately 15 tons. Enough for about 5,000 men to receive a small package. The remaining 255,000 men in the pocket received nothing except the bitter knowledge that their commanders thought chocolate was more important than ammunition. Soldiers who received Christmas packages shared them with comrades, but the gesture only highlighted the airlift's absurdity. One staff officer recorded in his diary, "Christmas supplies, chocolate for 5,000 men. We are 260,000. Someone has a sense of humour. January 16th, 1943. Pitomnik airfield was overrun by Soviet forces attacking from the west. The loss was catastrophic. Pitomnik was the largest and best equipped field in the pocket, capable of handling multiple aircraft simultaneously. With its loss, the airlift shifted to Gumrak, a smaller field closer to Stalingrad with shorter runways and worse facilities. Aircraft that could land at Gumrak were limited to lighter loads. Daily supply deliveries, already inadequate, dropped by 60%. Engineers attempted to prepare emergency landing strips on frozen lakes and open fields, but these were usable only by the smallest aircraft and only in perfect weather. The Luftwaffe made desperate efforts to continue operations, flying more sorties with fewer aircraft, pushing crews beyond exhaustion, accepting loss rates that in any rational calculation would have ended operations. But the airlift had become a matter of political necessity for Hitler and Goering. Admitting failure meant admitting the Sixth Army would starve. So the flights continued, pointless and deadly, until they physically couldn't. January 22nd, 1943, Gumrak airfield was abandoned as Soviet forces closed in. The last transport aircraft took off at 11 p.m, carrying wounded men crammed into the fuselage so tightly they couldn't sit. The pilot later reported he counted 92 men loaded aboard an aircraft designed for 12 passengers plus crew. He took off overweight engines, straining, barely clearing the rubble at the end of the runway. The airlift was effectively over. A few desperate flights attempted to land supplies at improvised strips or drop supply containers by parachute, but these delivered negligible amounts. January 25th, the final aircraft landed in the pocket, a single Ju-52 carrying medical supplies. It took off minutes later, overloaded with wounded, and was shot down by Soviet fighters 40 kilometers from the pocket. There were no survivors. The airlift had lasted 72 days, delivered approximately 8,350 tons total, less than 16% of requirements. Aircraft losses, 488 destroyed, 1,000 aircrew dead, the transport fleet shattered. And the Sixth Army, which had been promised unlimited supply by air, was starving to death in the ruins of Stalingrad. January 10th, 1943, 7:30 in the morning. Soviet artillery erupts along the western edge of the Stalingrad pocket. 7,000 guns and mortars, the largest concentration of firepower assembled on the Eastern Front, fire simultaneously in a bombardment that lasts for hours. This is the opening of Operation Ring, the Soviet offensive to liquidate the Sixth Army pocket. For 2 months, Soviet forces have contained the encirclement, probing defences, tightening the ring, and waiting for the trapped Germans to weaken from starvation and cold. Now, with the Sixth Army reduced to a shadow of its former strength, Soviet command launches the final assault. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Don Front, has assembled 281,000 troops, over 5,000 artillery pieces, and 257 tanks for the operation. They face a German force that on paper still numbers 180,000 men, but in reality consists of skeletal soldiers, so weakened by hunger that many can barely walk. The Sixth Army has already died. Operation Ring is merely the burial. The condition of the Sixth Army in early January was beyond what any civilization should tolerate. The daily ration had been reduced to 100 grams of bread per man, roughly a single slice, plus minimal amounts of horse meat or nothing at all. Men were consuming between 800 and 1,000 calories daily, while defensive combat and exposure to cold required 3,000 to 4,000 calories. The mathematics of starvation are brutally simple. The human body, denied adequate calories, begins consuming itself. Fat disappears first, then muscle tissue, finally organ tissue. Soldiers in the pocket looked like animated corpses, faces skull-like, eyes sunken deep in sockets, ribs visible through torn uniforms, limbs reduced to bone covered by skin. Movement required enormous effort. Men shuffled, rather than walked, conserving every calorie. Guards fell asleep at their posts, not from negligence, but from exhaustion. Some soldiers simply sat down in the cold and never rose, dying quietly from hypothermia. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties by ratios of 3 or 4 to 1. Temperatures in January ranged from -20 to -35 Celsius. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms with inadequate winter gear, suffered terribly. Hands froze to metal weapons. Feet froze inside boots that couldn't be removed without tearing away frozen flesh. Ears, noses, and cheeks developed frostbite within minutes of exposure. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with frostbite cases. Doctors, lacking anesthetics, performed amputations with surgical saws, while soldiers screamed or bit down on leather straps. Severed fingers, toes, hands, and feet piled up in heaps outside field hospitals. Some surgeons amputated limbs that might have been saved because there was no capacity to provide the lengthy treatment required for less severe frostbite. Men with amputated legs lay in unheated cellars waiting to die, knowing they would never be evacuated. The field hospitals were scenes from hell. Wounded and frostbitten soldiers lay on stone floors in cellars, buildings, or ruins without heat, light, or adequate medical supplies. Dressings were reused after cursory washing, spreading infection. Surgeries were performed without anesthesia because supplies were exhausted. Men screamed through operations or passed out from pain. Doctors worked by candlelight or flashlights, conducting surgeries in temperatures barely above freezing. Wounded who would have survived with proper care died from gangrene, sepsis, or simple exposure. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. The frozen ground was too hard for graves, so corpses were stacked like cordwood outside hospitals, awaiting mass burial that never came. Medical personnel, themselves starving and exhausted, continued working from a sense of duty even as they recognized their efforts were pointless. One surgeon recorded in his diary, "What is the point of saving a man's leg when he will starve to death in 2 weeks? Disease ravaged the pocket alongside starvation and cold. Typhus, spread by lice, that infested every soldier's clothing, killed thousands. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, weakened men already near death. Pneumonia and bronchitis, inevitable in men. Sleeping in unheated ruins while malnourished, filled lungs with fluid and killed quietly. Medical officers estimated that 50% of the army was suffering from some disease or condition requiring treatment. But treatment was impossible. There was no medicine, no clean water, no sanitation, no warmth. Men sickened and died, and their comrades stepped over the bodies because there was nowhere else to step. The Sixth Army was experiencing conditions comparable to concentration camps, a fact that nobody in the pocket failed to notice with bitter irony. Soviet Operation Ring began with the southwestern sector of the pocket. Artillery bombardment shattered German defensive positions weakened by weeks of combat and neglect. Infantry divisions that began the encirclement with 12,000 men now fielded fewer than 2,000 combat-effective soldiers. Machine gun positions were manned by single soldiers, or sometimes left unmanned because everyone was dead or too weak to fight. Artillery batteries, rationed to 10 shells per gun per day, couldn't respond to Soviet fire missions. When Soviet infantry advanced, they encountered resistance that ranged from fanatical to non-existent. Some German units fought desperately, firing until ammunition was exhausted, then engaging in hand-to-hand combat. Others surrendered en masse, soldiers simply walking towards Soviet lines, with hands raised, too exhausted to care about military honor or fear of captivity. The pocket began shrinking. January 10th through January 17th. Soviet forces compressed the western edge, capturing Potomnik airfield and cutting the pocket in half. German units attempted to retreat eastward but lacked the transport, fuel, and physical strength for organized withdrawal. Defensive lines collapsed more from exhaustion than from Soviet pressure. Units simply ceased to exist as cohesive formations, dissolving into small groups of men trying to survive one more day. January 20th through January 25th, the pocket was compressed again. Soviet forces pushing from all directions, squeezing the defenders into an area 15 kilometers by 10 kilometers. Over 90,000 German soldiers and remnants of Romanian units were crowded into ruins with no food, no shelter, and no hope. Paulus, at his headquarters in the Univermag department store basement in central Stalingrad, watched his army die with helpless horror. Situation reports arriving hourly told the same story. Units collapsing, positions overrun, ammunition exhausted, casualties mounting. He drafted messages to Hitler requesting permission to surrender, to end the suffering of his men. Every request was denied. Hitler's responses, when they came, emphasized duty, honor, and the historical significance of the Sixth Army's sacrifice. Every day you continue fighting is a day gained for the entire Eastern Front, one message read. It was true in a narrow tactical sense. Soviet forces engaged at Stalingrad couldn't be deployed elsewhere. But the cost of this tactical benefit was the deaths of 200,000 men. Paulus knew it was pointless, knew his army was already destroyed, but he continued obeying orders because that's what he had done his entire career. The end came in disconnected stages rather than a single moment. Individual units ran out of ammunition and surrendered. Officers, seeing their men dying pointlessly, negotiated local surrenders with Soviet commanders despite standing orders forbidding capitulation. Some soldiers simply walked towards Soviet lines individually or in small groups, preferring captivity to death. Paulus made no effort to stop these surrenders, tacitly accepting that the army was finished. His staff burned documents, destroyed equipment, and prepared for the inevitable. Major General Schmidt, still fanatical, argued they should fight to the last man as Hitler demanded. But even Schmidt recognized that last man was approaching rapidly. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal in a final, desperate attempt to compel suicide rather than surrender. The gesture was transparent and insulting. Paulus understood he was being ordered to kill himself to maintain the fiction of German invincibility. January 31st, 1943. Soviet forces stormed the Univermag department store where 6th Army headquarters sheltered. Paulus, in his basement bunker, made no attempt to resist or escape. He simply waited for Soviet soldiers to arrive, accepted his capture with quiet dignity, and signed documents acknowledging his surrender. The next day, February 1st, the northern pocket of the 6th Army, still fighting under General Karl Strecker, was overrun. On February 2nd, Strecker surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. 91,000 German and Romanian soldiers surrendered, skeletal figures in rags who looked more like refugees than soldiers of an elite army. The rest, 174,000 men were dead, killed in combat, starved to death, frozen in the rubble, or died of disease and wounds. The 6th Army, which 6 months earlier had been the most powerful German field formation, had been annihilated. Friedrich Paulus, who had led them into the pocket and then refused to lead them out, was now a prisoner, beginning a captivity that would last 10 years and force him to confront the consequences of his obedience. December 15th, 1942. A cellar in the industrial district of Stalingrad. Corporal Hans Schneider, 23 years old, sits with his back against a frozen stone wall, writing a letter to his parents in Bavaria. The letter is forbidden. German military censors prohibit any correspondence that might reveal the desperate situation in the pocket. But Schneider writes anyway, knowing the letter will never be sent, needing to express what cannot be spoken aloud. Dear Mama and Papa, he writes, I do not think I will see you again. We have nothing to eat except frozen horse meat, and not much of that. The cold is beyond anything I imagined. Men are dying every day, not from Russian bullets, but from hunger and cold and simply giving up. I am not afraid of death anymore. I am only tired. Please know that I loved you and that I tried to be brave. Schneider folds the letter, places it in his uniform pocket, and goes back to his guard post. 3 days later, he will be killed by a Soviet sniper. The letter will be found on his body by a Soviet soldier who cannot read German and uses it to start a fire. Schneider's story is unremarkable. Thousands of similar letters were written in the Stalingrad pocket. Almost none survived. The psychological disintegration of the 6th Army was as total as its physical destruction. Military units are social organisms held together by discipline, comradeship, shared purpose, and belief in their cause. When these bonds break, armies cease to function as organized entities and become mobs of individuals concerned only with survival. The process at Stalingrad was gradual but inexorable. In November, when the encirclement began, morale remained surprisingly high. Soldiers believed relief would come quickly. that the pocket was temporary, that German military prowess would prevail as it always had. December brought the first cracks, the failed relief attempt, the inadequate airlift, the realization that rescue might not come. January brought complete collapse, starvation, cold, disease, and the knowledge that they had been abandoned by their commanders and their country. Suicide rates in the pocket are impossible to calculate precisely, but evidence suggests they were substantial. Officers filed reports of soldiers shooting themselves, though these were often disguised as combat casualties to spare families the stigma. Witnesses described men who simply walked towards Soviet lines with their weapons pointed at their own heads, pulling the trigger before surrendering. Others stepped into open ground and stood still, waiting for snipers to kill them. Some chose more passive methods, removing their coats and lying down in the cold, dying of exposure within hours. German military law considered suicide, while under orders to be desertion, punishable by posthumous disgrace and denial of benefits to families. This created perverse incentives. Soldiers who wanted to die might provoke Soviet fire rather than shoot themselves, seeking death that would be recorded as honourable. Psychiatric casualties overwhelmed the medical system's ability to respond. Combat stress reactions, called war neurosis or combat fatigue in contemporary terminology, manifested in various ways. Some soldiers became catatonic, sitting immobile and unresponsive to external stimuli. Others developed uncontrollable tremors, violent shaking that made holding weapons impossible. Some experienced selective mutism, unable to speak but capable of following orders, mechanically. The worst cases were complete psychological breaks. Men screaming incoherently, attacking their comrades, or curling into fetal positions and refusing all interaction. Medical officers had neither the training nor the resources to treat psychological trauma. Most psychiatric casualties were simply left in field hospitals, lying on floors alongside wounded, waiting to recover or die. Discipline, the foundation of military effectiveness, eroded steadily. Courts martial for desertion, cowardice, and self-inflicted wounds continued throughout the pocket's existence, but enforcement became increasingly arbitrary. Some commanders maintained rigid discipline, executing soldiers for minor infractions to maintain control. Others tacitly accepted minor violations, understanding that starving men couldn't be held to peacetime standards. Military police executed dozens of soldiers for desertion or unauthorized surrender attempts, but these executions couldn't stop the erosion of cohesion. By late January, entire units ignored orders, officers lacked the authority to compel obedience, and the army existed in name only. Some soldiers hoarded food, stealing from comrades. Others formed small protective groups, trusting only their immediate circle. The social contract that bound the army together had dissolved. Yet remarkably, some units maintained discipline and fighting effectiveness until the end. Elite formations like the 16th Panzer Division and the 71st Infantry Division continued executing orders, maintaining defensive positions, and conducting coordinated operations even in January. Officers in these units led by example, sharing hardships with their men, refusing special privileges, and maintaining routines that provided structure. Soldiers responded to leadership they respected, fighting not for Hitler or Germany, but for their officers and comrades. These units were exceptions, islands of cohesion in an army drowning in chaos. But their brawn, existence, proved that military effectiveness depended less on material conditions than on leadership and unit cohesion. The problem was that most Sixth Army units lacked both. General Friedrich Paulus's psychological state deteriorated in parallel with his army. The hand tremor that had plagued him for months became constant and severe, his hand shaking so violently he couldn't write legibly. His left eye developed a pronounced tic that gave him a ghastly, haunted appearance. He lost over 40 pounds, his uniform hanging loose on his gaunt frame. Staff officers reported that he barely slept, pacing his office at 3 or 4 in the morning, reviewing casualty reports and drafting messages to Hitler that became increasingly desperate and incoherent. Paulus refused to eat more than his soldiers received, a gesture of solidarity that earned respect, but did nothing to improve the situation. He seemed to be engaging in performative suffering, demonstrating that he shared his men's pain, while doing nothing substantive to end it. Some staff officers believed Paulus was suffering a psychological breakdown. He had difficulty making decisions, even minor administrative ones. He would stare at maps for hours without issuing orders. He repeated himself in conversations, forgetting what he had said minutes earlier. His speeches to staff became rambling and disconnected, mixing operational discussions with philosophical reflections on duty and fate. When subordinate commanders requested guidance, Paulus often deferred to Schmidt, his chief of staff, effectively abdicating command authority. Yet Paulus never lost his obsessive need for approval from higher command. Every message he sent to Hitler or Army Group headquarters sought validation, reassurance that he was doing the right thing, confirmation that the suffering had purpose. He seemed psychologically incapable of accepting that he had led his army to destruction through obedience to insane orders. The relationship between soldiers and their commanders soured as the pocket's situation became hopeless. Junior officers and enlisted men began openly blaming senior leadership for their suffering. Graffiti appeared in ruins. "Thanks, Hitler," and Goering's air bridge. Soldiers muttered curses against Paulus, calling him weak and incompetent. Some openly stated that if given the opportunity, they would shoot their officers before surrendering to Soviets. This breakdown of military hierarchy was unprecedented in the Wehrmacht, which had prided itself on discipline and respect for authority. But when soldiers are starving to death because their commanders followed orders that everyone knew were suicidal, respect for authority dies with the first man to freeze in his foxhole. Religious faith became both solace and source of anguish. Christian soldiers prayed for deliverance, for relief, for survival. When prayers went unanswered and conditions worsened, some lost faith entirely, concluding that no benevolent God would permit such suffering. Others deepened their faith, interpreting suffering as divine test or punishment for Germany's sins. Military chaplains, themselves starving and freezing, conducted services in ruins and cellars, offering spiritual comfort while having no material aid to provide. Some chaplains struggled with theological questions they couldn't answer. Why would God abandon faithful soldiers? What sin had they committed to deserve this? One chaplain's diary, recovered after the war, recorded his crisis of faith. "I tell men God is with them, but I no longer believe it myself. If God is here, he is watching us die and doing nothing." The final weeks in the pocket saw complete psychological collapse for many. Soldiers sat in ruins, staring at nothing, unresponsive to orders or even to Soviet attacks. Others wandered aimlessly, lacking the cognitive capacity to understand their situation. Some experienced hallucinations, visions of food, of warm homes, of loved ones calling them. Officers reported men having conversations with dead comrades, arguing with people who weren't there, responding to orders nobody gave. The line between sanity and madness, always thin in combat, disappeared entirely in Stalingrad's final days. The Sixth Army died psychologically before it died physically. Men's minds breaking under pressures no human psychology was designed to endure. And through it all, Friedrich Paulus maintained the fiction of command, issuing orders to units that no longer existed, reporting to higher headquarters that still demanded impossible sacrifices, obeying until there was nobody left to obey. January 8th, 1943, 9:30 in the morning. German sentries in the western sector of the Stalingrad pocket observed something unusual. 3 Soviet officers approaching their positions under a white flag. Behind them, a trumpeter plays a signal. The German sentries, confused and suspicious, train their weapons on the approaching group but hold fire. White flags mean parley, a military custom honoured even in this savage war. The Soviet officers reach the German lines and present a sealed document to a German captain. The document, written in German and Russian, is addressed to General Paulus and Field Marshal von Manstein. It is an ultimatum, surrender now, and Soviet command guarantees the lives, medical treatment, and eventual repatriation of all prisoners. Refuse and the Sixth Army will be annihilated. The deadline, 24 hours. The German captain accepts the document and sends it by courier to Sixth Army headquarters. The ultimatum, Operation Ring's preliminary phase, has begun. It offers the Sixth Army its last chance for survival. Paulus will refuse it. The Soviet ultimatum was carefully crafted psychological warfare. The document Signed by General Konstantin Rokossovsky commanding the Don Front and Major General Mikhail Voronov, representing the Soviet Supreme Command, acknowledged the Sixth Army's desperate situation with clinical precision. "Your situation is hopeless." It read, "You are encircled by strong Soviet forces. Relief efforts have failed. The Luftwaffe cannot supply you adequately. Your troops are starving, freezing, and dying of disease. Further resistance is senseless and will lead only to further casualties." The terms offered were generous by Eastern Front standards. Officers could retain their sidearms and personal belongings. Wounded would receive immediate medical treatment. All prisoners would receive normal rations of bread and food, and repatriation to Germany would follow the war's conclusion. The ultimatum carefully avoided threatening language, presenting surrender as a rational choice that would save lives rather than a humiliating capitulation. Stalin's motivation for offering terms was both practical and propagandistic. Militarily, reducing the pocket through assault would cost Soviet casualties and consume time and resources needed elsewhere. If the Germans surrendered voluntarily, those forces could be redeployed immediately. Propagandistically, a voluntary surrender would be far more valuable than a forced capitulation. Stalin wanted the prestige and psychological impact of a German Field Marshal choosing to surrender rather than being overrun. A voluntary surrender would demonstrate that even elite German forces recognized the futility of continued resistance. It would damage German morale far more than another hard-fought defeat. Moreover, Stalin understood that treating prisoners well, at least initially, would encourage future German surrenders. The ultimatum was calculated to achieve all these objectives. The ultimatum reached 6th Army headquarters at noon on January 8th. Paulus read it in the presence of his Chief of Staff, Arthur Schmidt, and several senior officers. The room was silent as Paulus read the document twice. Then he placed it on his desk and looked at Schmidt. The Chief of Staff's response was immediate and explosive. Accepting Soviet surrender terms was unthinkable, treasonous, a betrayal of everything the German army represented. German soldiers did not surrender while they could still fight. The Führer had ordered the 6th Army to hold Stalingrad, and that order remained in effect until explicitly countermanded. Moreover, Schmidt argued, Soviet promises were worthless. They would execute officers and enslave enlisted men in labor camps. Better to die fighting than trust Bolshevik promises. Schmidt's vehemence silenced any staff officers who might have argued for accepting the terms. Paulus's response to the ultimatum was characteristic. He forwarded it to higher command without recommendation. He composed a message to Field Marshal von Weichs at Army Group B and to Hitler's headquarters, describing the Soviet offer and requesting instructions. The message was bureaucratically proper, but morally cowardly. Paulus commanded the 6th Army. The decision whether to surrender was his alone under military law. But Paulus, true to form, would not make that decision without explicit permission. He framed his message as informational rather than seeking authorization, but everyone understood he was asking Hitler to decide, and everyone knew what Hitler's response would be. The Führer had never permitted surrender of a surrounded force. He had court-martialed generals who surrendered without his permission. Asking Hitler whether to accept the Soviet ultimatum was asking permission to commit an act Hitler considered treasonous. Hitler's response arrived on the evening of January 9th, 18 hours after the ultimatum was received. The message was brief and absolute. Surrender is out of the question. The 6th Army will do its duty and fight to the last man and last bullet. Every day you hold draws Soviet forces away from other fronts and serves Germany's strategic objectives. The message was typical Hitler. Emphasis on duty, appeal to, sacrifice, and complete disconnection from reality. Fighting to the last man would kill everyone in the pocket without achieving any meaningful strategic goal. But Hitler's worldview couldn't accommodate retreat or surrender. He lived in a fantasy where will could overcome material reality, where German soldiers could subsist on honor rather than food, where dying pointlessly was preferable to living with defeat. Paulus received this response and accepted it without protest. January 10th, 1943, 8:05 in the morning. The Soviet deadline expired, without German response. At Don Front headquarters, General Rokossovsky had expected this outcome, but was disappointed nonetheless. Stalin, informed of the German refusal, authorized Operation Ring to proceed. At 8:30 a.m., Soviet artillery opened fire with 7,000 guns, and the final assault began. The men of the 6th Army, who might have survived as prisoners, would now die as combatants. The choice was made not by the soldiers who would suffer the consequences, but by commanders for whom their deaths served political purposes. Hitler needed martyrs to maintain the myth of German invincibility. Stalin needed a crushing victory to demonstrate Soviet strength. And Paulus, caught between these forces, chose obedience to Hitler over mercy to his men. Inside the pocket, soldiers' reactions to the ultimatum's rejection ranged from resignation to rage. Some had hoped their commanders would accept, seeing surrender as the only rational option. Others shared Schmidt's view that German soldiers should never surrender, but most simply felt betrayed. They had been told repeatedly that relief was coming, that the Luftwaffe would supply them, that their suffering had purpose. Now they learned that Soviet forces had offered survival and their own commanders had refused it on their behalf. Letters and diary entries from the period reflect bitter disillusionment. They will let us all die, rather than admit defeat, one sergeant wrote. We are not soldiers anymore. We are sacrifices to Hitler's pride. Another wrote, the Russians offered us life, and our generals chose death for us. If I survive this, I will never forgive them. Some units attempted unauthorized surrenders despite orders forbidding it. Company and battalion commanders, seeing their men dying and recognizing that further resistance was pointless, negotiated local truces with Soviet forces opposite their positions. These officers risked execution for treason but chose to save their men rather than obey orders they considered murder. German military police executed several officers caught attempting unauthorized surrender, but the executions couldn't prevent the erosion of cohesion. By late January, unauthorized surrenders were occurring daily, sometimes by entire companies. Soviet forces encouraged this by broadcasting promises of food and medical treatment into German lines and by treating surrendering soldiers well within view of German positions. The contrast between Soviet promises and German reality was stark. Paulus himself struggled privately with the decision to reject the ultimatum. Staff officers reported seeing him staring at the Soviet document for hours, rereading it repeatedly, clearly wrestling with conscience. But he never seriously considered accepting it without Hitler's permission. His entire identity was built on obedience. Accepting the ultimatum would mean disobeying a direct Führer order, accepting personal responsibility for the army's fate, and acknowledging that he had led his men into a trap from which surrender was the only escape. These were psychological impossibilities for Paulus. He had spent his career avoiding independent decisions, deferring to higher authority, and executing orders regardless of personal judgment. Changing that pattern at this ultimate moment was beyond his capacity. The man who could plan brilliant operations couldn't make the moral choice to save the men who trusted him to lead. The rejected ultimatum became one of history's great what-ifs. If Paulus had accepted on January 8th, approximately 180,000 men would have surrendered. Soviet camps were brutal, and many would have died in captivity. But tens of thousands would have survived to return home after the war. Instead, by fighting another 3 weeks, the 6th Army lost an additional 40,000, killed, and reduced the number who surrendered to 91,000, of whom only 6,000 survived captivity. Paulus's refusal of the ultimatum condemned an additional 90,000 men to death. It was the final, tragic consequence of a command philosophy that valued obedience over wisdom, orders over lives, and duty to Hitler over duty to the soldiers under his command. The perfect staff officer, given the choice between saving his army and obeying his Führer, chose obedience. And 200,000 men paid the price. February 2nd, 1943. A column of German prisoners, approximately 12,000 men, shuffles westward through the frozen steppe under Soviet guard. These are the remnants of General Karl Strecker's 11th Corps, the last 6th Army formation to surrender. They walk slowly, skeletal figures wrapped in blankets and rags, many barefoot because their boots disintegrated weeks ago. Soviet guards watch them with a mixture of contempt and pity. Some guards offer bread to prisoners who collapse. a gesture of humanity that confuses German soldiers conditioned to expect Slavic savagery. The column passes through villages destroyed in the fighting, past burned-out tanks and equipment, past unmarked graves containing thousands of bodies. At the front of one section walks Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, distinguishable from his men only by the remnants of his uniform and the iron cross still pinned to his chest. He walks with his head down, hands trembling, saying nothing. He is beginning a captivity that will last 10 years and 8 months, a journey that will transform him from Hitler's obedient general into the Third Reich's most prominent military critic. The man who refused to disobey will learn, slowly and painfully, the cost of his obedience. The immediate aftermath of surrender was chaos and horror. 91,000 German and Romanian soldiers surrendered between January 31st and February 2nd. Soviet forces were unprepared for this mass of humanity despite knowing the surrender was imminent. Prisoner assembly points lacked adequate shelter, food, or medical facilities. Thousands of prisoners, already weakened by months of starvation, died in the first days of captivity simply from exposure and exhaustion. Soviet guards, themselves operating on minimal rations, had little food to share. Water was scarce, sanitation non-existent, and medical care overwhelmed by the scale of need. Prisoners huddled together for warmth in ruins or open fields, waiting for transport to permanent camps that were already overcrowded with prisoners from earlier Soviet victories. The march westward killed thousands more. Prisoners were organised into columns and force-marched to rail stations where they would be loaded onto trains for transport deeper into the Soviet Union. The marches covered 50 to 100 kilometres through winter weather without adequate food, water or rest. Men who collapsed were left behind, either dying where they fell or being shot by guards who lacked resources to care for them. Soviet records indicate approximately 15,000 German prisoners died during these marches, bringing the immediate post-surrender death toll to approximately 20,000. The survivors reached rail stations where they were loaded into unheated freight cars, 40 or 50 men per car designed for 20, and transported eastward on journeys lasting days or weeks. Many more died in transit, bodies frozen in the overcrowded cars, discovered only when destinations were reached. Paulus's initial captivity was slightly better than his men's, though still harsh by any standard. Soviet intelligence immediately identified him as the highest-ranking German prisoner of the war, a intelligence and propaganda asset of immense value. He was separated from other prisoners and transported to Moscow with senior members of his staff. The journey took 5 days by rail and road, travelling through a country devastated by war. Paulus saw destroyed cities, burned villages, and refugee columns. He saw the scale of destruction that German invasion had caused, something abstract when planning operations, but visceral when witnessed personally. Soviet guards treated him correctly but coldly, providing adequate food and shelter but making clear he was an enemy, not a guest. In Moscow, Paulus was housed in a dacha in Voikovo, a suburb north of the city used for high-value prisoners. The facility was comfortable compared to the camps where his men suffered: heated rooms, adequate food, even books and writing materials. NKVD interrogators began intensive debriefings, asking detailed questions about German military organisation, operational planning, and Hitler's command style. Paulus cooperated with factual questions, providing information about military matters he considered no longer sensitive. But he refused political discussions, declined to criticise Hitler, and rejected suggestions that he make propaganda statements. His initial position was that he had been a soldier following orders, that he bore no personal responsibility for Germany's policies, and that he would wait out the war in captivity and return home when it ended. This position would not survive contact with reality. The summer of 1944 brought the first cracks in Paulus's psychological armour. On July 20th, German military officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb planted at his headquarters in East Prussia. The attempt failed, but its existence shattered Paulus's worldview. He had believed the Wehrmacht officer corps was united in loyalty to Hitler, that soldiers did not betray their supreme commander regardless of personal disagreements. Learning that fellow officers, including some he knew personally, had attempted to kill the Führer forced Paulus to confront uncomfortable questions. If other officers believed Hitler had to be removed by violence, what did that say about the regime Paulus had served? If assassination was justified in their minds, perhaps obedience to Hitler had not been the highest duty after all. Soviet interrogators, recognizing this psychological moment, increased pressure on Paulus to reconsider his position. August 8, 1944. This was the day Friedrich Paulus crossed a line from which there was no return. After months of pressure from Soviet interrogators and internal psychological struggle, he agreed to join the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German prisoners advocating for Germany's surrender and the overthrow of the Nazi regime. Paulus signed a public statement condemning Hitler's leadership, calling the Führer's strategic decisions disastrous and urging German soldiers to stop fighting a war that was already lost. The statement was broadcast by Soviet radio into Germany and dropped as leaflets over German lines. It caused sensation in Germany, where Paulus was still remembered as the commander of Stalingrad. Hitler reportedly flew into rage, ordering that Paulus's family be arrested and interrogated. Paulus's wife, Elena, was subjected to Gestapo investigation and public disgrace. His sons, serving in the Wehrmacht, were sidelined from active duty under suspicion of disloyalty. Paulus's reasons for joining the National Committee were complex and have been debated by historians for decades. Soviet pressure was certainly a factor. Interrogators made clear that cooperation would result in better treatment. But Paulus was not tortured, and other generals resisted similar pressure without breaking. More likely, Paulus experienced genuine ideological evolution. He had spent months in captivity, reflecting on Stalingrad, reviewing decisions that led to the disaster, and confronting the reality that Hitler's orders had killed his army. He read Soviet newspapers reporting German retreats and defeats, saw the trajectory of the war, and recognized that Germany would lose. Most critically, he learned details of Nazi atrocities, Holocaust operations, and mass murders committed by German forces in occupied territories. These revelations horrified him. Paulus had convinced himself that he served Germany, not Nazism, that the Wehrmacht fought a clean war separate from SS crimes. Learning the extent of German atrocities made that position untenable. Paulus's propaganda work for the Soviets intensified throughout late 1944 and 1945. He made radio broadcasts urging German units to surrender, recorded statements criticizing Hitler's military leadership, and even testified about German war crimes. His most significant propaganda contribution was a detailed account of how Hitler's orders had doomed the Sixth Army, including specific examples of requests for withdrawal that were denied and promises of relief that were lies. Soviet propagandists used Paulus's testimony extensively, crafting messages designed to demoralize German troops and encourage surrender. The effectiveness of this propaganda is debatable. Most German soldiers viewed Paulus as a traitor and discounted his statements. But some units did surrender, citing Paulus's broadcasts, and his defection created psychological impact disproportionate to its military results. November 1945. World War II had been over for 6 months. Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally in May. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. The Third Reich had ceased to exist. But Paulus remained in Soviet captivity, now a prisoner without clear status. The war for which he had been captured was over, yet Stalin refused to release him. Soviet leadership valued Paulus as a witness for ongoing denazification trials and as a potential asset for influencing post-war Germany. Moreover, Stalin was in no hurry to release German prisoners generally. Soviet industry needed labor, and German POWs provided it. Approximately 3 million German prisoners remained in Soviet camps in late 1945, forced laborers rebuilding the country their invasion had destroyed. Most would not be released for years. November 1946. The Nuremberg Trials, the international tribunal prosecuting major Nazi war criminals. Paulus appeared as a prosecution witness, testifying about Hitler's command decisions and German military crimes. His testimony was devastating. He described Hitler's Commissar order, which mandated the murder of Soviet political officers, and confirmed that Wehrmacht commanders, including himself, had distributed and implemented this criminal directive. He testified about the Führer's refusal to allow withdrawals, the stand-fast orders that led to unnecessary casualties, and the atmosphere of fear in German high command, where officers who questioned orders risked dismissal or worse. Paulus's testimony provided authoritative confirmation of Wehrmacht complicity in Nazi crimes, undermining the clean Wehrmacht myth that many former German officers were already constructing. Paulus's Nuremberg testimony earned him permanent hatred from former Wehrmacht colleagues. They viewed him as a traitor who broke the unwritten rule that soldiers do not testify against their own side regardless of circumstances. Letters and memoirs from German generals in Western captivity described Paulus in scathing terms: coward, turncoat, disgrace to the uniform. Some argued his testimony was coerced, that Soviets had broken him through torture or threats. Others suggested psychological breakdown, that the stress of Stalingrad had destroyed his judgment. Few were willing to consider that Paulus's testimony was motivated by genuine moral reckoning, by belated recognition that he had served an evil regime and that speaking truth about that service was necessary for Germany's future. The years of captivity stretched on with soul-crushing monotony. Paulus remained in Soviet custody long after other high-ranking prisoners were released. He was held not as punishment, but as leverage, a potential asset whose value might increase. He lived in various facilities, always under guard, but treated respectfully. He read extensively, studied Russian, and wrote memoirs that Soviet censors reviewed. He had no contact with his family. His wife Elena had died in 1949 in West Germany, and his sons had emigrated one to the United States, changing their surnames to escape association with their father. Paulus was alone, isolated from his past life, uncertain about his future, living in a limbo where each day was identical to the last. October 1953. Joseph Stalin had died in March, and the new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev was implementing reforms, including releasing long-held prisoners. Paulus was informed he would be released and could return to Germany. But which Germany? The country was now divided into Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and German Democratic Republic, East Germany. West Germany was democratic, capitalist, and aligned with the United States. East Germany was communist, authoritarian, and a Soviet satellite state. Paulus chose East Germany, a decision that shocked observers. His sons lived in the West and urged him to join them. But Paulus believed West Germany was rehabilitating former Nazis, while East Germany represented a genuinely new start. Whether this belief was sincere or pragmatic is unknowable. Some historians suggest Paulus feared prosecution in West Germany for his role in military operations. Others argue he genuinely believed in socialism after years of Soviet exposure. Paulus's final years in Dresden, East Germany, were quiet and isolated. He worked as inspector of police, a ceremonial position with minimal responsibilities. He lived modestly in a small apartment, avoided public appearances, and declined most interview requests. The East German government used him for occasional propaganda purposes, parading the former Field Marshal as proof that even elite German military officers recognized socialism's superiority. But mostly, Paulus was ignored, an embarrassing reminder of a war everyone wanted to forget. He died on February 1st, 1957, aged 66, of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. His death received minimal attention in East or West Germany. His grave in Dresden was simple, rarely visited, eventually falling into neglect. The man who commanded the 6th Army at Stalingrad, whose decisions and indecisions killed 200,000 men, died alone and largely forgotten. His transformation from obedient general to regime critic was complete, but it came too late to redeem his greatest failure: the inability to disobey when obedience meant death for everyone under his command. May 9th, 1945. Moscow, Red Square. Captured German battle standards and regimental colours are thrown at the base of Lenin's mausoleum in a victory parade celebrating Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender. Among the hundreds of captured banners are those of the 6th Army divisions destroyed at Stalingrad, the 71st Infantry Division, the 94th Infantry Division, the 16th Panzer Division, and dozens more. Soviet soldiers hurl the standards onto a growing pile, trampling them underfoot, a ritual humiliation of the enemy who invaded their country. Stalingrad has become the Soviet Union's defining victory, the battle that turned the tide of World War II. the moment when German invincibility shattered permanently. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, standing on Lenin's mausoleum, reviewing the parade, watches the captured banners accumulate and reflects on the battle that cost 1.1 million Soviet casualties but destroyed Germany's finest army. The name Stalingrad will echo through history. But what of Friedrich Paulus, the German general who led his army into that disaster? How should history judge the man who obeyed orders unto death? The casualty figures from Stalingrad are staggering and disputed. German records indicate approximately 265,000 men were encircled when the Soviet trap closed on November 23, 1942. By February 2, 1943, when the last unit surrendered, 91,000 remained alive to become prisoners. The other 174,000 died in the pocket, killed in combat, starved to death, frozen in the ruins, or succumbed to disease and wounds. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, approximately 6,000 survived Soviet captivity to return home, most not released until the mid-1950s. The survival rate for Sixth Army soldiers was approximately 2%. 98% died either in the pocket or in captivity. Soviet casualties were even higher. Approximately 1.1 million killed, wounded, or missing during the entire Stalingrad campaign, from August 1942 through February 1943. The battle was the bloodiest in human history, surpassing even Verdun in World War I. The strategic impact of Stalingrad extended far beyond the immediate destruction of the Sixth Army. Germany lost its offensive capability on the Eastern Front permanently. The Wehrmacht would launch one more major offensive, Operation Citadel, at Kursk in July 1943. But after that failure, German forces would fight entirely defensive operations until the war's end. The Sixth Army's destruction eliminated 22 divisions from German order of battle, losses that could never be fully replaced. More critically, it demonstrated to Germany's allies that the Wehrmacht could be defeated decisively. Romania, Italy, and Hungary began secret negotiations with the Allies, seeking exits from an alliance that was clearly doomed. The psychological impact on German morale was devastating. Stalingrad was the first major defeat acknowledged publicly, shattering the myth of invincibility that Nazi propaganda had carefully constructed. Friedrich Paulus's responsibility for the Stalingrad disaster is complex and has been debated by military historians for 8 decades. He did not create the strategic conditions that led to disaster. Those were products of Hitler's war aims and operational directives. He did not decide to attack Stalingrad. That order came from Hitler. He did not create the vulnerable flanks held by Romanian armies. That was a function of German manpower limitations and alliance politics. But Paulus made critical decisions that worsened the situation and foreclosed options that might have saved his army. His decision to continue attacking into Stalingrad throughout September and October, committing all reserves to urban combat, left the army with no mobile forces to respond when the Soviet offensive came. His refusal to break out immediately when encircled on November 23rd, waiting instead for Hitler's permission, allowed the Soviet encirclement to solidify. His acceptance of Hitler's stand-fast order on November 24th doomed the army to destruction. The most damning assessment of Paulus comes from the counterfactual. What would have happened if he had acted differently? Military historians have extensively war-gamed various scenarios. If Paulus had ordered immediate breakout on November 23rd, before receiving Hitler's orders, approximately 130,000 to 150,000 men would likely have escaped the pocket. Casualties would have been heavy, perhaps 50,000 killed or captured during the breakout, but more than half the army would have survived. If Paulus had accepted von Manstein's implicit authorization on December 19th and broken out to meet the relief force, approximately 80,000 to 100,000 men could have escaped. Even accepting the Soviet surrender ultimatum on January 8th would have saved approximately 90,000 men from death, though many would have died in captivity. Every decision point where Paulus chose obedience over independent action cost tens of thousands of lives. Defenders of Paulus, few though they are, argue that his situation was impossible and that no commander could have done significantly better. Hitler's personal involvement in operational decisions, they argue, made independent action career-ending or worse. Generals who disobeyed Führer orders were relieved of command, court-martialed, sometimes executed. Paulus knew this and rationally calculated that disobedience would result in his removal and replacement with someone equally obligated to follow Hitler's directives. Moreover, defenders argue, the fuel shortage was genuine. The Sixth Army lacked petroleum for mobile operations, making breakout problematic regardless of will. Finally, some argue that Paulus's stand-fast defense, while costly, achieved strategic results by pinning down Soviet forces that could have been used elsewhere, delaying Soviet offensives and possibly preventing deeper penetrations into German-held territory. These defenses are unconvincing to most historians. The career consequences argument essentially says Paulus valued his position more than his soldiers' lives, which is morally indefensible. The fuel shortage argument ignores that breakout on foot, abandoning heavy equipment, was possible and preferable to starvation. German infantry divisions had marched thousands of kilometres during the invasion, marching 50 kilometres to escape encirclement, while difficult, was feasible. The strategic benefit argument is technically true, but morally grotesque. Yes, the Sixth Army's sacrifice delayed Soviet operations, but this benefit could have been achieved by withdrawal to defensible positions rather than death in place. Hitler's strategy of trading lives for time might have been rational from a purely military perspective, but it violated basic ethical obligations commanders owe soldiers under their command. Comparison with other German generals illuminates Paulus's failures. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely regarded as Germany's most capable operational commander, repeatedly withdrew from untenable positions despite Hitler's orders, preserving his forces to fight another day. General Walther Model, another highly regarded commander, disobeyed Hitler multiple times, conducting tactical withdrawals to save his units, and was never relieved because his results justified his independence. General Heinz Guderian openly argued with Hitler about operational decisions and survived because the Führer valued his abilities despite his insubordination. These generals understood that obedience to suicidal orders was not the highest form of military virtue, that commanders had discretion to interpret orders in light of circumstances, and that preserving combat power was more important than holding worthless ground. Paulus understood none of this. He was a staff officer playing at field command, executing orders brilliantly, but never questioning whether those orders made sense. The clean Wehrmacht myth, constructed by German generals after the war, attempted to separate the Wehrmacht from Nazi crimes by portraying the military as professional, apolitical, and bound by honour codes that prevented participation in atrocities. Paulus's role in distributing and implementing criminal orders, like the Commissar Order, demolishes this myth. He knew the orders were illegal, knew they violated the laws of war, and distributed them anyway through normal channels. His testimony at Nuremberg, while valuable in establishing truth, was self-serving. He portrayed himself as merely following orders, while ignoring that international law established at Nuremberg held that following illegal orders was not a defence. Paulus's moral reckoning came too late to redeem his wartime actions, and too conveniently to be entirely credible. The assessment of Friedrich Paulus must account for both his technical competence and his moral failure. He was an excellent staff officer, brilliant at planning complex operations, meticulous in logistics, and superb at coordinating large forces. His role planning Barbarossa, while ultimately disastrous, demonstrated real skill. His execution of the Kharkov encirclement showed operational ability, but staff excellence does not translate to field command excellence. Field commanders must make independent decisions with incomplete information under extreme pressure. They must disobey when orders are wrong. They must accept responsibility for outcomes. Paulus was incapable of these things. He was promoted beyond his abilities, given responsibilities that exceeded his character, and failed catastrophically when tested. Paulus's post-war transformation from Hitler's general to anti-Nazi witness was genuine but insufficient. His testimony at Nuremberg was truthful and valuable. His denunciation of Hitler's leadership was accurate. His acknowledgement that Wehrmacht cooperated with Nazi crimes was important. But transformation that occurs after defeat, after hundreds of thousands have died, after the regime has collapsed, is not moral courage but moral convenience. True courage would have been disobeying Hitler in November 1942 when the Sixth Army could still be saved. True courage would have been refusing to implement criminal orders in 1941. True courage would have been resigning rather than executing operations he knew violated the laws of war. Paulus did none of these things. His post-war criticism of Nazism, while genuine, cannot erase his wartime complicity. The final assessment must be that Friedrich Paulus was a tragic figure, but not a sympathetic one. He was tragic because he was a skilled professional destroyed by a system that demanded obedience over wisdom. He was trapped between military culture that valued following orders and a regime that gave criminal orders. But he was not sympathetic because he chose obedience consciously and repeatedly when alternatives existed. Other generals found ways to resist, to disobey, to save their men. Paulus did not because he lacked moral courage, because he valued his career over his conscience, because he was fundamentally a staff officer who could implement decisions but never make them. 200,000 men died because their commander obeyed orders he knew were wrong. That is Friedrich Paulus's legacy. And no amount of post-war testimony or late-life remorse can change it. Stalingrad stands as a monument to the dangers of blind obedience, to the catastrophic consequences when institutional loyalty supersedes moral judgment, to what happens when excellent technical skills are divorced from ethical wisdom. The battle was a German defeat and a Soviet victory, but more fundamentally, it was a failure of command. A case study in how brilliant planning and meticulous execution are worthless without the moral courage to question orders and protect the lives entrusted to your command. Friedrich Paulus, the perfect staff officer, failed the ultimate test of leadership. His grave in Dresden, rarely visited and mostly forgotten, is a fitting memorial to a man who achieved technical excellence but ethical failure, who could plan operations brilliantly but couldn't summon the courage to disobey when obedience meant death. History remembers Stalingrad. It should also remember the lesson of its German commander, that competence without conscience is not leadership but complicity, and that following orders is not virtue when the orders are evil.